Welcome. In the next couple of hours, I'm going to shake things up. I'm going to ask the questions that need asking. I'm going to change your perception about the world around you and blow your mind wide open. I'm going to take you places that will expand your reality. This is the Disclosure Media Network.
Tonight's guest is Dietrich, a former Department of Defense research librarian for almost a decade, responsible for incinerating highly classified materials on critical topics such as Pearl Harbor, Roswell, Vietnam, and other different ethnic holocausts, as well as documents exposing the reality behind vampires, zombies, Soviet psychic warfare, and other occult phenomena. Volumes of notes on Tesla, H.P. Lovecraft, L. Ron Hubbard, the Vatican, the United Nations were destroyed, along with reams of reports detailing everything from military intelligence, sponsored drug smuggling operations to experimental mind control programs. Records plundered from both Allied and enemy states articulated the hidden objectives of modern mass movements. Douglas, it's a pleasure to have you on tonight. Our listeners are absolutely excited to have you here with us. How are you doing?
Doing fine. Much the better for speaking with you. We've worked in the past on other venues. Very glad to see that you've expanded and really taken on some new venues which do a lot more justice to the subjects that we're discussing.
Absolutely. It really is. And it's great to be here with you. There's so much going on around the world today. And with more and more people waking up, I feel like it's a really good time for people like yourself that is exposing the truth for what it is. It might bring more of a bullseye on your back, but at the same time, with the public backing up and listening to what you have to say more and more now in the open field, I guess, it's really kind of protecting people like you and others that are exposing some of this madness that's out there. With all the training that you had in the military, I was wondering if you could share that with our listeners first, the special training that you had and what background you had before we get into the documents and the real, I guess you could say, meat and potatoes of tonight's topics.
Sounds great, and I really want to thank you for broaching that subject. Now, it's important to remember that the documents that I destroyed as a documents destruction specialist, which was one of my primary responsibilities as a Department of Defense research librarian, this was all done as a civilian. And this is what confuses many people. I was interviewed, of course, by the international magazine known as Nexus Magazine. Nexus Magazine is, of course, published by Duncan Rhodes, and the only reason I bring that up is so that people can, at their leisure, ultimately look that up and source many other aspects of what we're discussing tonight, primarily concerning the Second World War as we broach aspects of that topic. He even flew me down to Australia to deliver presentations. It was a disaster, and this is part of the horrible lifestyle of being a whistleblower. It was a disaster because I had not basically left the house functionally in any real sense for about 11 years. And the reason for that wasn't because I was in my house all boarded up and hiding. Quite honestly, I was doing a lot of leakage like I did in the military itself and in the Department of Defense itself specifically, which it needs to be emphasized is military but civilian. The people in the Department of Defense do not get field training. They're not dressed in uniforms. They're not saluting each other. They're not following a chain of command in the military sense. And the security, for all intents and purposes, is beyond non-existent. It is beneath contempt. The United States military security itself, within the military framework, is so execrable as to be functionally non-existent. We can touch on a bit of that, but the point is, I'm trying to emphasize just how corrupt the entire machine is, and one of the reasons why it's so corrupt is because there's an enormous mystique about it that's based on ignorance. And the ignorance of the body politic sources from a lot of misguided impressions that are quite notional in nature as opposed to based on facts. So they are mythopoeic as opposed to realistic. And a good aspect of that is the fact that people don't realize that the entire Department of Defense put together, which is 100,000 bureaucrats, and none of them in uniform. And then you take that and you mix it with the Coast Guard, which is a military branch, the National Guard, the Reserves, all the military armed services together, and it's less than 1% of the U.S. population. And so very few people are really familiar with the military, and yet you'll hear everybody say, oh, I've got cousin Vinny in the military, or, brother Bubba is in the military. And you hear all these people say that, and they'll all say he's got top secret security clearance, and a lot of them don't realize, of course, that that's the absolute rock bottom of security clearances in the Department of Defense of the U.S. military. Practically, you get a top secret security clearance just by joining. I mean, when you have that few people in the military, basically every single one of them at one point or another is going to be exposed to something that they, quote unquote, shouldn't see. Now, because most of them can't contextualize the, shall we say, the macro scheme of things, what in the civilian world would be called the macroeconomic impact of what they're seeing, none of them are really going to put two and two together and create anything that's discernible or coherent. So it's just meant to emphasize to everyone, just don't talk. Of course, it never really works, and everybody talks, but nobody that they're talking to really listens, because the greatest protector of America's secrets is the fact that its own tax-paying American public refuses to believe that they have no governance and they have no defense. That basically, if you enter a federal building, which most people do, you're not going to be going into the guts of the federal building. You're not going to be seeing what goes on in most of the offices. And if you go on an open military base, you're not really going to be seeing the day-to-day corruption that goes on inside. So they have a delusion. It's not even an illusion. It's a delusion because it's self-delusion. They self-delude themselves into thinking we have continuity of government. We have a government that is going to bump people off. Now, they would if they had that capability, and they sometimes carry it off. But more often than not, they trip over themselves and they blow open great gaping holes in their own toes and feet, and everything gets messed up, and all kinds of things spill out. And one of the granddaddy of all whistleblowers, Daniel Ellsberg, was an excellent example of that. A fellow Marine, a fellow whistleblower, and someone who almost went to jail for the rest of his life, and the only reason he escaped was an astronomical series of coincidences that worked in his favor. And without going too much in depth to that story, that brings us to the whistleblowers and why the Australia trip was so bad, why it's so horrible to be a whistleblower. You got other whistleblowers like Snowden, like Assange, like Chelsea Manning, who was once known as Bradley Manning. And these whistleblowers have all paid a terrible price for their whistleblowing. These are bona fide whistleblowers. Chelsea Manning will spend the rest of her life in prison. Assange will spend the rest of his life in prison. Now, whoever doesn't think he's in prison doesn't understand the situation. He's under house arrest, effectively, in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And if he leaves that Ecuadorian embassy, Assange is going to be transported back to the United States, taken to Gitmo, and effectively tortured to a state of near death for the rest of his miserable existence. And Snowden would face that same fate if he leaves Moscow. So Putin, of course, will basically keep him as a thumb to stick in the eye of every administration by maintaining him in Moscow, where, by the way, he does not want to be. He was given the choice of the Galapagos Islands, of the which is, of course, in Ecuador, a special safe house. He was given a choice of many other tropical and rather paradisical environments with which to relocate himself in immunity, and Vladimir Putin will not let him leave. So he's effectively a prisoner of Vladimir Putin as a political pawn. So, yeah.
I want to jump in on Snowden for a second, because a lot of people feel that the majority of the information that he has released is stuff you can find on the internet anyway. And you look at him on the news, and he's getting interviewed, and he's got two beautiful women behind him, and it's just like he's getting all this attention in Russia, and it seems like they're using him, they're spinning him somehow. Is he legit, or is there more to it than meets the eye?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I think that needs to be asked, of course, about any whistleblower. Now, the difference between asking a question of the legitimacy of what they're presenting and dismissing them is enormous. The problem with the American public, and the reason these secrets get so protected, is because the American public will flat out just deny and dismiss whatever they don't want to hear, specifically if it makes them look foolish or less cool or somehow less quote-unquote streetwise. But the majority of Americans need to come to terms with the fact that they are incredibly ignorant, and that when someone says something they don't want to hear or don't like to hear, that doesn't mean it's not true. As a matter of fact, more than likely, it's going to be true. Now, let's take a look at what these guys exposed just really briefly. Chelsea Manning, and I will get to Snowden, because Snowden was, of course, NSA. NSA was saying, she took everything. Now, by the way, that's a literal quote. NSA public relations officer said he took everything. And now, all of these people, yet when you take a look at what they've exposed, including Assange to WikiLeaks, they really didn't expose anything, unfortunately or sadly, of consequence. Now, Assange and Manning are directly related. Now, both of these people were genuinely involved in trying to make a name for themselves and make a dent in the world around them and conduct themselves into some kind of social change, particularly Manning. Now, Manning was, of course, in the United States Marine Corps, and like many other branches of the United States Armed Services, which for the longest period of time was predominantly male, they are gay. The United States Armed Services, I don't care, and Marines get totally upset when I say this. Now, of course, I was a Marine in Operation Desert Storm. Any one of the branches of services is saturated with homosexuality, so this has been a big issue, the entire don't ask, don't tell. Well, Manning was essentially, this is another aspect of military life. This is a very small subculture. Most people are entirely unaware of it. They have fantasies about it. They have no concept of the reality of it, which is basically, it's like a prison. A prison is predominantly an all-male environment. As a matter of fact, all of our penitentiaries in the United States altogether, you take into account our prison population is basically, to round up a number, 98% male. So the U.S. military is only beginning to put a chink in that kind of, shall we say, numerical statistic of their own. And they're still predominantly a macho community and going very far into the other direction of homoeroticism in many cases. Now, Manning was in this environment where you've got predominantly men and you've got a lot of gays. He was gay, he was openly gay, and he was essentially a prison bitch, which is the term we use for many of the officers. He was a corporal. He was basically sleeping with and bending over for and blowing a lot of generals and colonels and higher-ups, and basically was very angry at Obama's stance at the time as his executive commander-in-chief, refusing to basically lift the don't ask, don't tell policy. So he took all of this information and gave it over to Assange. Now, take a look at what he gave to Assange. He gave him a bunch of State Department secrets as well as military secrets. Now, all of this was genuinely classified material, so how does a corporal, I don't care how many generals, corporals, and colonels that this guy is sucking off and bending over for, I mean, without even going too vulgar about it, I mean, this guy was doing all kinds of things and getting all kinds of information leaked to him in return, but he's on site in Afghanistan, and he gets all these State Department secrets. So how the hell does this happen? I mean, we're not even talking about this. This is a civilian branch of secrets that he gets as opposed to a DOD branch of secrets. So that's absolutely got to be a controlled hemorrhage, a controlled leak. So, and then when he leaks it out to the public, and it goes out on WikiLeaks through Assange, who is far more suspect, a character, not in the sense that he's necessarily malevolent, but rather manipulated, which is something you brought up about the potential for many whistleblowers. Assange, of course, was in Australia, a place where I was flown to by Nexus magazine, and where basically, in a very real sense, I lost everything. It's basically, I hadn't gone out of the house in about 10 or 11 years. I put everything in the bag because I was going to be there for over 2 weeks. So I put in all the necessities I needed, which was basically all I had. And like a Secret Service agent, you follow the president around all of your life, and you live out of a bag. And so it was the same with me reverting back to my old security and mercenary habits, put everything I needed in a bag, took it all with me. It was all stolen by Virgin Australia. By the way, that's not even defamation or slander. They themselves said, yes, it was all stolen. And so it's one of those things which is on public record where Virgin Australia just said, we stole everything. And that was it.
What was their excuse?
So I was in Australia with nothing. Oh, by the way, and there was no records. I flew there. So I was going to be stuck there the rest of my life. And apparently what they had intended was, and they set me up to go to Australia very easily, by the way, and I always knew that this was dangerous. I had to do what I had to do because this is what I do. If
and
I'm not going to
listen,
this was last year or so. I mean, I'm trying to purge it from my memory, but people can look this up. My Nexus magazine trip to Australia was, I believe, about a year and a half ago. So, but my point is that with the Australia, what's important about it as a Commonwealth nation is, like most other places in the world, you're guilty till proven innocent. So that means that while I was down there, and the records were totally wiped that I had ever arrived, at that point, I was essentially going to become homeless in Australia. And at that point, anytime they wanted, it would be unavoidable that I talk to people of all ages, of all sexes, at any time. Someone could have accused me of rape, of theft, of anything, and of course, being a guilty to your proven innocent country, I could have spent the rest of my life in jail in Australia. Now, before I went down to Australia, like I said, I hadn't traveled in over a decade. I had no passport. So what happened was I applied for a passport, and they said, well, we don't have any record of your last passport, which is understandable. Most of the work I did was security in the past. I wasn't even using a passport. So I said, well, I'd like to apply for one. What do I need to do? And they said, send us your birth certificate. I had to send them my birth certificate to the State Department, and I thought I wouldn't hear from them for months. And I get my birth certificate back along with a passport within 48 hours. It was sent to me by a courier. This was how bad they wanted me to go down to Australia. Now, if it weren't for a bunch of old mercenary tricks that I learned while I was doing private security enforcement on contract all around the world in the past during the 1990s, I never would have gotten out of Australia. I'd still be down there today, almost certainly in jail, because somebody would have accused me of something, anything. I would have been unable to defend myself and unable to afford a lawyer, and I would have been there for the rest of my life. I'm sure I would have been accused of something serious, murder or something like that. Now, that is the situation that I managed to escape from, just barely out of Australia, but I lost everything I had. So that is the life of a whistleblower, and that's mild. Also, it's important to emphasize, all of my relatives are dead. All of my family is dead. My mother and father, who were the only last living relatives I cared about, are dead. My sister is dead. The closest blood relations I have are dead. So unless a whistleblower is coming at you and they are in a situation like myself where they basically have nothing, I mean literally nothing, and they are barely making it and all the relatives are dead, unless they're like me, they can't be real. Because if somebody's coming at you and they're saying disclosure, let's talk disclosure, and they've got a wife, they've got kids, there's no way, if they're saying anything that is important at all, that their family's going to be left alive. Now, all of this sounds contradictory to what I just said about the government's incompetence, its corruption, its inability to get anything done, that you're functionally not governed. But it's a lot like Cuba. If you go to Cuba, the first thing you notice is that everyone's in third world poverty. There is a lifestyle which almost nothing works. Everybody's jacking electricity. They basically take poles of metal and they lean it up against telephone poles and they leach the electricity from the telephone poles. Exceptionally dangerous and a fire hazard. 24 hours a day, but that's how they power the television sets from which they watch state-run television. Now, there's one thing that does work in Cuba, and that's the secret police. Anyone complaining, anyone bitching about anything can get hauled off and disappear forever. Now, in the United States, the secret police are entirely incompetent. They're buffoons. But what you need to respect is their ubiquitousness and the fact that they have a bottomless budget and that they hit soft targets. Now, I myself am not a soft target. So in terms of everyone around me, elderly, weak, female, child, all of them are dead and gone because they are soft targets. We're soft targets. So that's what you need to look at when you're looking at people. Also, their background, again, the first thing you'll notice, if you take a look at my background, say, for instance, I was lying about who I am and I was bagging groceries for 10 years, then that would be infinitely easy to find because all they would have to do to discredit me is dredge up years and years of photographs of my working at Safeway or something like that because they'd be on security cameras. Look, there's Douglas Dietrich bagging groceries. Look, there's Douglas Dietrich waiting tables. Look, there's Douglas Dietrich swiping the floor as an odd job. None of that has been brought up. They've got nothing on me. My entire background is a blank. It's zero, nada, zip. It's erased. It's the same with, and believe me, that is not normal. That is entirely not normal. You can take a look at yourself. You can take a look at Jason, your producer. You can take a look at anybody you know, and they've got photos of you, Jason, your family, floating around on the internet everywhere. If somebody said, hey, I want a picture of your father, they could dig up a picture of your father on the internet. You can't do that with mine. You can't do that with any relative of mine. They're gone. They're white. And when you turn towards somebody like Assange, here's this guy in charge of WikiLeaks, but his entire family was photographed in Australia because he was a member of a cult. Obviously, an MKUltra or Project Monarch or Project Artichoke affiliated program where he and his entire family all had their hair bleached unnaturally white, glaringly white. They were all wearing sunglasses. They looked like clones or albino children out of the Village of the Damned. And none of that was genetically natural. They were all part of this alien cult, or what you would call a xenophile cult, or a cult that believed that aliens were somehow, space brothers were somehow manipulating us. No doubt the voices beamed into their head from Langley, Virginia. Now, I'm being facetious, but you understand what I'm saying. So here's this guy who's grown up in a controlled environment, sets up a WikiLeaks, reveals what this other guy, who's quite earnest, Manning revealed, and who's now a girl. And what is it that they're saying that makes such a fuss? Well, basically nothing. They say that 1 million people were killed by the Americans in Al-Iraq, where I had served in Operation Desert Storm. Now, not to dismiss or disparage or denigrate the magnitude of death suffered by the civilians in Iraq, far from it, but rather to respect or honor the fact that they were mass murdered, we have to realize the fact that you'd have to be an idiot not to have assumed that the Americans had murdered over 1 million people in Al-Iraq by the time that Manning had revealed those records. You'd have to be one dumb son of a bitch not to have realized that. With what the Americans were doing day by day with depleted uranium, with Blackwater, and the massacres that were being carried out that were never recorded by any government establishment because they weren't massacres that were conducted by government agents or agents of the government, in this case the military. So you've got the situation where, of course, people are dying, and it's horrible, and it's a humanitarian crime. It is a war crime and a crime against humanity, and the fact that Bradley Manning revealed it revealed, in a very real sense, the obvious. Far more repugnant or repulsive was the fact that nothing was done about it. Basically, the Americans expressed umbrage or some outrage, but there was no cry for war crimes trials. There was no cry to bring the people in charge to justice, because this was a controlled hemorrhage of something that anybody with common sense would have assumed. And who got punished? Bradley Manning. And the claim was, of course, he had put people's lives in danger. No one died because of Bradley Manning. But he, now she, Chelsea Manning, will spend the rest of her life in jail. Assange is effectively in jail the rest of his life in the Ecuadorian embassy. And then we come to Snowden. Snowden, of course, reveals basically nothing. He tells you that, hey, they're listening in on your private phone calls. Okay, well, if you didn't assume that,
right.
you must be one dumb son of a bitch. Like privacy means anything. What is the biggest thing that the United States always pushes? They push freedom of speech. Douglas Dietrich, you would be lined up against the wall and shot. In China, where you was born, it's important to emphasize that I am a Chinese national. I am a U.S. citizen because my father was a United States serviceman. So I was born overseas in the Nationalist Republic of China. I was relocated onto the island of Taiwan. So I'm a Chinese national, but by dint of my father being who he was, I am a naturalized American citizen. By the way, far more of a U.S. citizen in terms of legal definition than our President, Executive Commander-in-Chief, Barack Hussein Obama. Now, which is part of the irony of all of this, but also quite logical. Because he is not a citizen of the United States by any definition of the term at all, every order that he gives as Executive Commander-in-Chief is illegal. That means that any order that the military carries out under his command, these are why all of these drone strikes are referenced by the military in colloquial. Their nomenclature is Obama strikes. Now, that way, they can always foist it back on him. They can say, look, all of our orders were illegal. They were given by an executive commander-in-chief who was a false president. He was not a citizen, and therefore you have to put him in jail the rest of his life or execute him. And as a result, he's totally under their thumb. And because they've got him totally under their thumb, they can order him to do whatever they want, and in the end, he would be held responsible if he ever tries to pull away. So in that sense, he is probably the most pitiful and powerless president the United States has ever had. Truly an empty suit with a hand up his ass that's feeding him one-liners. Horrible, but true.
Now, who put him in power? Like, who actually orchestrated it to where he was able to get the position, commander-in-chief?
Well, that's interesting because, whoever they are above the Clintons and they are above the Bushes, which means that they are higher up of the higher ups. And here's how I can say that with such confidence. President Bush Sr., of course, most people don't think of it this way, had 3 administrations. He basically, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was a 3-term president. And the reason he was able to pull that off was because he was the man who manipulated an actor, literally an actor, and this is part of the insanity of the American people, is that they're very similar to people in Asian India. Now, here's something else to emphasize. You have basically a borderline retard like George Bush Jr., who literally, without question, is pretty much a high-grade moron. And this individual has been on air saying, yes, we are the world's largest democracy. Well, that is, absolutely horseshit, because the largest democracy in the world is not the United States, it's India. India has over 1 billion people, and it's growing every day. They have a democratic system, and many people vote for actors in India who portray God. They have a Hindu pantheon, a Hindu religion, and many actors and actresses will portray these gods on television dramas, soap operas about the Hindu gods and goddesses, and they are essentially accepted by many of the population of India at the lower levels of education as the real thing. And so they'll go traveling and people will throw them garlands, get down at their feet and kiss the ground. I'm not kidding. And, of course, they get elected to political positions. So in India, you have a set of politicians, a good deal of them, who are actors and actresses who are literally worshipped as gods, believe to be such, believe to hold divine powers. People think they can fly, literally, because they do it on television. And they vote for them. And, that's what it was like with Reagan. And so you've got Ronald Reagan, and what did he do? He was he was a far better actor as a president than he ever was in the movies. And one of the reasons why was because he basically stopped acting and just started mouthing and blathering lines, kind of like the best person to compare him to would be Burgess Meredith. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but Burgess Meredith suffered, and they can look this up. They can do their own research. Burgess Meredith's family released his medical records because they wanted people to come to grips with Alzheimer's in the very same sense that Nancy Reagan admitted to Alzheimer's on the part of her husband. The point is Nancy Reagan did this many years after his administration was over. Burgess Meredith, his family, started talking about his Alzheimer's while he was acting, and they admitted the fact that he could not remember anything he was doing. Burgess Meredith would get in front of the camera. He would reiterate lines because he loved his work. He had been trained as an actor, and that training held to the core of his very being, to the point where they held up placards and cards in front of him. Everything he says in the 1980s Clash of the Titans, he remembers none of it. He's dead now, so he can't remember anything. But he literally, while he was making the film, he didn't know he was doing it. So they would just toss him in front of films, like every film from Rocky and afterwards. Burgess Meredith had no idea of what he was doing. He literally was just mouthing words. He'd go home and be taken care of by his parents and his family, and many other relations. His parents may have participated in that. They were still alive for all I know. But he had people literally wiping his ass on the set and otherwise, and changing his diapers, and he had no idea of what he was doing. Reagan was exactly like that. No ifs, no ands, no buts, no excuses. That's exactly what Reagan was like. So the person running it, who got him into that position, was George Bush Sr. And George Bush Sr. did it by destroying the lives of the elite Delta Force. Because President Jimmy Carter was going to rescue the Iranian hostages, the American hostages being held in Iran. He assembled Delta Force, deployed them into the desert, and their helicopters fell out of the sky. Their rotor blades literally unscrewed, and they just fell out of the sky and crashed into each other and burned. Now, there's no way that one or two helicopters are going to crash into each other like that, and then others have their blades just literally fall off naturally. I mean, there's no way, synchronistically, that accidentally an entire fleet of helicopters just going to fall out of the sky like that. So obviously they were sabotaged, and they were sabotaged at home by the Central Intelligence Agency. And the reason that was done was because Jimmy Carter was made to look like a total fool, and he was voted out of office, and Reagan was voted in. That was the October surprise. So when Reagan was voted in, the real power behind the throne was, of course, George Bush Sr. This is a man who ran the Central Intelligence Agency. This was a man who, by the way, had been approached by Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter had gone up to George Bush Sr., who at that time was running the Central Intelligence Agency. Jimmy Carter had just become president, and Jimmy Carter had said, Bush, I've seen UFOs. I know you know more than you're talking about as the person who's in charge of the CIA. You were put in charge of the records for the Roswell document. The entire CIA was created after the Roswell incident to cover up the Roswell incident. What exactly are you hiding? I want to know what's going on. And George Bush Sr. said, sure, you make me the J. Edgar Hoover of the CIA, and I'll tell you what you want to know. And Jimmy Carter said, no, I'm your executive commander-in-chief. You do what I say. You don't bargain with me. You follow my orders. And then George Bush Sr. said, well, fuck you. I'm going to take you out of office, and I'll put myself in. That's an exact exchange between him and Jimmy Carter, and that's exactly what he did. He got Jimmy Carter out of office, railroaded in the actor, because he had no charisma himself. I mean, he's a thoroughly dislikable, contemptible fellow. And so they put in Reagan, and Reagan, of course, worked like a champ. He controlled it, because Reagan was sleeping 18 hours a day. Not kidding, by the way. That's what Reagan was notorious for. And then, so after Reagan was out, then George Bush Sr. ushered himself in, and then he had his one administration, and suddenly out of nowhere, Clinton shows up. Now, Clinton, of course, is nothing but Dixie Mafia. Clinton was running for president. He was governor of Arkansas, and he was going to visit San Francisco and campaign in the 1990s. And basically, he was going to be at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in San Francisco. Now, that's when I was still working at the Presidio military base in San Francisco. That was one of my last years there. We're talking about 1991, that area of time, 92, when he was running for president. And basically, I dealt all my life with mercenaries who showed up at the Presidio military base, because this is what a lot of ex-military men do. They've got nothing else that they're trained to do except kill people. So they work all their lives when they're out of the military, killing people on private contract. Now, if they've been in the military for a career, they have access to two great, shall we say, assets which help them do this. One of this is the use of military hostels, where they can go to military bases and sleep in the hostels, very cheap, like a youth hostel, at these various open bases. Also, they have use of MAC, or Military Airlift Command, which can take them not only anywhere in the United States, but anywhere in the world for functionally for free. Now, why does the military offer them this? Because that way the military can monitor the movement. So it works out for everybody. The military knows where they're going, when they're going there. They know they're going killing people for pay, but the military acts as their transport. So in that sense, the military basically has organized itself a mafia. So in this sense, I was dealing with these types all the time. Suddenly, one of them, Lieutenant Commander Robert Hunt of the Office of Naval Intelligence. By the way, this is not defamation of character or slander. The guy's in jail. As far as I know, the guy's going to spend the rest of his life in jail. But Lieutenant Commander Robert Hunt comes to the Presidio military base and tells me that President George Bush has ordered him to kill Clinton. So he has me organize a bunch of guys living in the hostels because I worked at the library. They all came to the library to read books, hang out, try to molest kids. By the way, I'm not kidding. This isn't just a cut or something. This is what they would try to do all the time. Libraries are infamous as areas of child molestation. That's how MANBLA became known as a library organization. Man-Boy Love Association, MANBLA. That was the acronym. That's actually a real organization, by the way. It did exist. People can look that up, and they were infamous for hanging out in libraries because that's where all the poor, bullied, insecure, victimized children would go to escape. They would go to libraries so that they could read science fiction and escape into fantasy and read Lord of the Rings and all the other stuff and escape from all the bullies who were beating them outside in the yard. Now, this is what would happen after school, everything else. They couldn't go play kickball or basketball with the rest of the kids or football. They would just be escaping getting beaten up, or maybe even at home. So they would all come to the library all the time to read books and escape. And that's where the MANBLA cuts would prey on them. So many of these veterans were just like that at the library at the Presidio. So I had open access. It was well known to communicating with any of these mofos at any time. And so Lieutenant Commander Robert Hunt ordered me to get together a hit team to kill Clinton. So while I tried to confirm this, I said to my operations manager, this man says he's with the Office of Naval Intelligence, but now he's being handled by the CIA and that they need to kill the governor of Arkansas. And so he says, well, don't talk to me about it, you stupid son of a bitch. Why don't you call Bob Larson, the guy who's running the CIA office in San Francisco? So I called Bob Larson. Bob Larson says, he's cool, man. He's legit. Get together a hit team. Take out the governor. So I'm just following orders. So I went through, helped get together this hit team. They're setting up weapons, taking all these photographs of the Ritz-Carlton. We're talking about avenues of escape, target distances, all the rest of that shit. And they even infiltrated some woman who came in. I'm not even remembering consciously. I have it written down, but I don't consciously remember her cover name. But her real name was supposedly Yosi Amir. And so she claimed she was with Mossad. And so her job was to seduce the security guard in the Ritz-Carlton. So apparently she was screwing this guy every night, and she had pictures of it to incriminate him, and her job was to get him to shoot Clinton in the back. Now, by the way, this was a combination of a JFK-RFK hit. In other words, JFK was hit by snipers. Robert F. Kennedy, I don't know if you're aware of this, was shot by a security guard. Now, by the way, this was exactly what the coroner said. Was basically when the autopsy was conducted on Robert F. Kennedy, the coroner said not a single bullet that was fired by Sirhan made it into the body of Robert F. Kennedy. Not a single bullet. That every single bullet that went into Robert F. Kennedy came from behind him, and the caliber of the bullet and the make of the gun, even the gunpowder, was all traced back to the firearm of the security guard behind him. Now, the security guard behind him moved to the Philippines, where he, to this day, will conduct interviews on how he killed Robert Kennedy. And you've never heard of him. And you've never heard of him. And so the point is, they were going to get the security guard at the Ritz-Carlton to do that, and they were going to get the snipers to take Clinton out simultaneously. So by the time they were going to be through with him, this guy was going to walk up the steps of the Ritz-Carlton, and by the time he reached the top of the steps, his shadow would have looked like the Eiffel Tower. And so by the time they had all this arranged, they turned around to me and said, God, you've been in such great help, Dietrich, but there's so much more you can do. I says, like what? They says, well, we need a patsy, J. Harvey Oswald. I said, yeah? And, well, we're looking at you. I said, well, that's not very flattering. And they're like, well, you know, guess what? The guy who's financing this, he's Chinese. You know, Chan Wang, he runs a real estate empire here in California. Does that mean nothing to you? It would be patriotic. And supposedly they were trying to convince her that this was all set up by Taiwanese expatriates who was definitely afraid that Clinton would abandon, quote-unquote, Taiwan. By the way, I don't know if you're familiar with the Taiwanese politics, but Taiwan was abandoned long, long time ago. the whole political angle they were taking didn't even make any sense. So I was desperately at that point trying to back out in some way or another, knowing I was going to die. And basically, luck worked in my favor. And again, just by a fortuitous set of coincidences, I was able to get out of it because the security guard that Josie Amio was sleeping with started to talk. He started to brag to other people he was going to take out Clinton. And because of that, they took him out. And he was pushed from his waiting in the queue, or quay, at the San Francisco BART train, Bay Area Rapid Transit, basically their subway here in the greater Bay Area of San Francisco. He was pushing from an oncoming BART train. Now, all this made the papers. Okay, the fact this guy was killed, Chan Wang's real estate empire was investigated and closed down. And you know what they investigated him and closed him down for? Participating in Operation Mount Rushmore. What was Operation Mount Rushmore? That was the attempt to kill Bill Clinton. So they even had a code name for it. It went public. You've never heard of it. That's the kind of politics that the military, the intelligence community, this is what they pull. And they do it all openly, blatantly, in your face. And everyone's so apathetic, they just take it. But this is the real way presidents get elected, or they don't. So Clinton basically came out of nowhere and somehow upset Bush Sr.'s plans to become president again. He upset them so badly that when he got in, after the abortive assassination attempt, by the way, and I was told face up front by Lieutenant Commander Robert Hunt, I was the next who was going to die. And then he effed up real bad, and he wound up in prison himself. And that was because of their murder of the security guard. So their murder was so incompetent, so blatant, even though it's publicly listed as a suicide, that guy wound up in jail. And so he's in jail the rest of his life. And he talked to a number of people, and I think that there's even books that have been published about this. So people can look this up, and they can verify from alternative sources exactly what I'm talking about. But in terms of myself and my observation about the politics of the United States, somehow out of nowhere, this Clinton dude shows up, becomes president. He wins because of people with big charisma, but that's really not the case. Clinton never won the election to become president. The person who upset it all and brought him into the White House by sheer accident was Ross Perot. Ross Perot, of course, caught all of the reactionary, ultra-conservative, militia-type vote, and as a result, or some would say the patriot vote, and because Ross Perot captured that vote, the Republicans lost, and their vote was divided by just a few votes. But if you really look at the number of votes that Clinton got, they were basically very few. Comparatively speaking, the only thing that squeaked him into the presidency both times, for both terms, was Ross Perot. And you wonder why Bush Sr. said publicly, I'm going to kill you. And what did Ross Perot say? He got on television and he said, I can't run for president anymore because Bush Sr. has threatened to kill my child at her wedding. My daughter at her wedding. He threatened to kill her and blow the wedding up, all this other good shit. Now, a lot of people who look this up will find out exactly what I'm saying. It's true. This guy went on national television and said Bush Sr. was threatening his daughter. Now nobody remembers this.
You know, I haven't heard that either, and I consider myself, you know, pretty knowledgeable in the conspiracy realms, and that brings me to another question I'd like to ask. It's a two-parted question. The assassination attempt on Reagan. Some chatter says that might be connected to Bush Sr. and his father. A lot of people talk about how he helped fund World War II. So if this is the case, it seems as if this is a long lineage. Some people say that they can take that family line all the way back to the pharaohs of Egypt. So is there truth to that? And
go on.
I was just going to say, is there truth to that? And if so, how do they continue to stay out of the grasp of the law?
Well, definitely, obviously, if they're that old and they've been manipulating the power structure for that long, they are the law. It's not a question of staying out of the grasp of the law. They write the laws. So if they're really that, now, by the way, I need to qualify that. That's not what I, myself, am trying to push. What I constantly push to the American public is the fact that you've got to escape your apathy. And the first thing you've got to do that will help you escape from that apathy is to give up the concept, which is quite fallacious, that the people who are in power are all powerful, that they're omniscient, that they can do whatever they want, that they can get away with anything, that they have some way to counteract everything that you do. Nothing could be further from the truth. There is an elite that is composed of families that have tended to have been powerful for quite some time. They are morbidly inbred. They are exceptionally incompetent. They are thoroughly corrupt. And you are basically have what governance you have is ultimately it answers to a group of, say, the equivalent of 8 intermarriages between first cousins. I mean, literally. That is how morbidly inbred they are. You're talking about somebody that is worse off in terms of their mental function than any portrayal you're given of redneck hillbillies in the Appalachians or something like that. I mean, literally, these people, they don't function even at all mentally very well. And I can go into some details about that, but we were talking about how these presidents get selected. So I'll finalize this with Clinton. Once he did get into power, you've got somebody who's basically, for all intents and purposes, he himself, by the way, claimed, and I don't know if you're aware of this, Clinton has publicly claimed on air that he's America's first African-American president. He says it's not Obama at all. He says it's me. He claims his daddy was black. Now, he says basically that, my dad ran away from home. I don't know what race he was, or I know what race he was, but nobody else does. But my mother, essentially, who was white, married a black guy. Now, in any other situation, had he not said that, everybody would simply dismiss him as an extremely charismatic piece of quote-unquote white trash. That they would think that this is the kind of guy who you drag $100 bill on a string to a trailer park, and Clinton would be the kind of guy to follow you out. He was basically considered by everyone to be white trash Dixie Mafia. And his wife was, of course, the brain who got him into power. She was basically somebody who was a Rhodes Scholar. His wife had gone to school in London. She was at Oxford. She had a sorority she was part of known as Hell's Harlots. And the sorority, and by the way, people can do research on this. They can vet everything I'm saying. Her sorority sisters were Tansu Çiller, who became the first prime minister of Turkey who was female. As a matter of fact, Tansu Çiller was so butch, she forced her husband to take her last name in a Muslim country. And her other sorority sister was Benazir Bhutto, and Benazir Bhutto said publicly multiple times that she considered herself a Muslim princess, basically considered herself a spoiled, the Muslim version of a Jewish American princess. So anyhow, Benazir Bhutto was literally royalty, and her monarch's dynasty ran the nation of Pakistan into the ground. And one of the ways that they did that was in cooperation with Mr. Trash himself, Clinton, while he was running Arkansas. Now, how did this work out? It was through what was known as Bloodgate. Now, Pakistan has had several major wars with India, and several of them, the last 2 or 3, threatened to go nuclear, because both India and Pakistan are nuclear-armed nations. Now, no one recognizes this in the United Nations, because the United Nations will still officially claim there's only 5 nuclear powers on Earth. You know, the big 5 from World War II. All of crap shit, of course. Nuclear proliferation is everywhere. But in reality, India and Pakistan have massive nuclear arsenals. And if they were to nuke each other, of course, we can only imagine the horror in human cost that would result. Well, they came that close several times. And in terms of their wars with Pakistan, these are full-out armored conflicts that take into account fighters, tanks, everything you can imagine. These are modern wars. And so because of this, Benazir Bhutto decided she was going to make a lot of money on the blood market. Now, why? Because of, say, for instance, the AIDS phenomena. Now, when I was 17 years old, I suffered because of all the stresses I was dealing with in terms of my environment and the H. pylori virus. Now, by the way, in those days, in the 1980s, when I contracted a bleeding duodenal ulcer, no one knew about the H. pylori virus. The H. pylori virus has since been credited or condemned as the cause of ulcers. Now, back in those days, it was considered to be stress. So I was diagnosed with, because I went to a military hospital as a military dependent, I was given a military diagnosis. I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. This was well before I entered the military. And so this is a situation where they said, well, all the stress is going up in San Francisco's Tenderloin, which is a horrible ghetto. It's one of the worst ghettos in the world, if not the worst. Anyone who doubts it has never lived in the Tenderloin. But at any rate, the reason it's got that name is because all the cops who patrolled the Tenderloin would get hazard pay and would be able to afford Tenderloin steak every night of the year because they were getting so much hazard pay. And so they would share it in shifts and rotations with each other because it was like entering a Vietnam combat zone. And, of course, it's known as Little Saigon because that's exactly where all the Vietnamese immigrants and Laotians and Hmong tribesmen were dumped as human refuse, flotsam and jetsam, as they were considered by the U.S. government after the Vietnam War. Many of them Amerasians or half-breed Chinese, etc. So it became Little Saigon, quote unquote. Now, they actually stabilized that entire area, which before then was a predominantly adult crash and burn and black community. And that was where, of course, the zebra killings went on. And that was back in the days when, all the while I was growing up, cops used to patrol the area with bullhorns, and they would shout out to all of the neighborhood population, blacks do not congregate. Blacks do not congregate, because they were so afraid of Watts-style, Los Angeles-style riots. So this was in the 1970s. The zebra killings were inspired by the Mau Mau killings of white people in South Africa. And so black people were just randomly picking up guns, killing white people randomly, and that's hence the term zebra killing, black on white killing. So all of this was going down while I was growing up, and just dealing with this every day, of course, that was one of the things that led to my diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder before even entering the military, because I was a military dependent who was going to a military hospital, Letterman Army Medical Center, where, of course, they trained 25% of all of the military doctors who would serve in the United States Army. Now, here's where some of the special things you talk about happened. When I was admitted to Letterman Army Medical Center for bleeding duodenal ulcers, I had bled out so badly they had to give me a full-body blood transfusion. So they couldn't use any of the blood from the blood market because that was so contaminated, because back in those days, believe it or not, if you can imagine this, they used to pay homeless people and drug addicts for their blood. So people who were addicted to street drugs and were injecting themselves with heroin and sharing all kinds of diseases with each other because they were resharing needles. People who were homeless and had any kind of disease you could imagine, people that were whoring themselves out and literally crawling with hepatitis, gonorrhea, syphilis, chlamydia, whether they were prostitutes or what they used to refer to horribly as queer whores, young men or chicken hawk who would patrol Chicken Hawk Lane, and males would pick up other males. Okay, all these runaway kids, all of them would be turning in their blood to get some money. And they'd get a free donut as well. So they'd get money, a donut, give a pint of blood. Now, all of this began to pile up, and statistically, all of the blood became infected with AIDS, became infected with every kind of disease you can imagine. And thanks to people like Governor Clinton of Arkansas, he would hold blood drives in prison. And, of course, in prison, they're all raping each other and screwing each other and sharing needles and doing drugs. So everybody, statistically, everybody in prison got something. And so he would donate all kinds of blood drive raised blood from the prison system in Arkansas. He'd put it on the world market so he could make money, and in exchange he'd offer the prisoners cigarettes, prison privileges. And so he and his wife, through what they did for the blood market, and they were given all kinds of credit. They were given all kinds of civic recognition for, oh, look at all the blood they've raised in Arkansas, you know, not telling anybody that they were getting it out of the prison system. Well, anyhow, they helped to crash the blood market. So when the blood market crashed, they couldn't give it to people in the military. So as a military dependent in a military hospital, I was given new experimental artificial blood. So not a single drop of blood in my body is human blood. All of it is synthetic blood. I do not have a single drop of normal human blood in my body. I was pumped so full of synthetic blood that I turned bone white, deathly white, as if I weren't even alive, because all the blood was white. So anyhow, later on, the marrow in my bones converted that to normal human blood, but that shows you how desperate the situation was in the military contending with the crash blood market. So Benazir Bhutto, sorority sister of Hillary Clinton, said, hey, I can make money off this. So she said to her general staff in Pakistan, hey, we might have another war with India soon. We'd better set up a blood reserve for our injured troops in the event that that war goes down. And of course, the general staff thought that was a capital idea. So she got 20,000 volunteer troops together and said, we're holding this big blood drive, you know, come on into these blood centers, you know, you'll filter out the other end and that'll be great, and you'll do this patriotic thing for your country, and this is under orders. So their own queen or princess gave them orders for this blood drive, and so all of these troops, by the way, in the military, of course, you're tested for AIDS, tested for Hep, tested for tetanus, tested for all that crap. Most of the time you're vaccinated multiple times, and they're testing constantly for syphilis and everything else, so they knew it was clean blood. So she basically got all these guys, the medics strapped them down, the corpsmen who were under special orders from her, and instead of taking 1 pint, the medics took 12. They strapped them down and they drained them dry. She killed 20,000 of her own men. Then she took all that blood, which was proven clean, tested for AIDS, she put it on the blood market, and she made a killing on the blood market. And then she had to leave the country. And she moved back to England and stayed there for the next 20 years in London. And so here's this crazy vampire bitch. And, of course, if she ever went back to Pakistan, they would string her up in her own intestines. And she did. She was that crazy. And here's how that happened. Was because basically when she made that killing on the blood market because of Clinton and many people like him crashing the blood market, and she was able to provide it with all this clean tested blood that went on the international market after that, military grade, military tested. Basically what happened was years later, Clinton, Hillary, was so confident she was going to be president that she called up Benazir Bhutto and said, I'm going to be president. You better go back to Pakistan so we can cooperate again and reset up CENTO. CENTO was the Central Treaty Organization that was the Southwest Asian version of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. People can look this up. There was a CENTO. And CENTO, of course, collapsed when Benazir Bhutto had to flee Pakistan, when the Shah had to flee Iran, because the three major parts of CENTO were Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan. And the other one was, of course, the United States. But these three nations, look at what I'm talking about. Two of them were run by Muslim women who were sorority sisters to Hillary Clinton. Turkey was run by Benazir Bhutto and, Tom Siller, and Benazir Bhutto, of course, ran Pakistan. Now, here's the situation that's just monumental in terms of the politics of the Islamic world. Nobody knows about it. Certainly none of the specialists who claim that they know about it. When I called up the author of the Lucifer Principle, I believe his name is David Goldblum or something like that, or I might be mistaken with Jeff Goldblum. People can look that up for me. But look up whoever the author of the Lucifer Principle was, of Lucifer Effect. That was this guy who used to be the agent, by the way, for Michael Jackson. Jewish guy, spent a good deal of his life in bed, claims he's got chronic fatigue syndrome. Anyhow, I called up that guy on air, on national radio, on Coast to Coast AM, told him about Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan. He had never heard of it. And this was a guy who was writing about Pakistan. This was a guy who was writing about foreign affairs. So the people who are advising, writing books on geopolitics, most of these people know absolutely nothing about the reality of the situation and what's going on and how the world is run or being run to the ground. Nobody knows these dynamics. And but what had happened was, how did they get to the point where Clinton was so convinced she was going to be president? It got like this. Basically, what happened was Clinton was in power for 2 administrations. Bush Sr. came to terms with the fact that there was this other family, so he basically invited them into the mafia. And that's why you see this white trash, half black guy sitting in a golf cart with Bush Sr., who's power elite of the Freemasonic cabal that considers themselves descended all the way back to the pharaohs of Egypt. So you've got him sitting in a golf cart with this other guy who, like I said, you drag a $100 bill on a string through the trailer park. This is the kind of guy who follows you out. And they're both sitting together in a golf cart together, hugging and kissing and, basically chumming it up for the cameras. No, they think he got off, but that's not the case. So here's the situation. He gets out of the White House. Then Bush Jr. comes in. Now, it was supposed to be Jeb, but they agreed later on, well, Jeb will be after Hillary. So they had this deal going, and to put this into perspective for you, when Clinton was in power, when Hillary was running the show and the male was just swinging his dick around, one of the things he had to do as the male, basically the penis, the strap-on. He was basically the strap-on for Hillary. Well, as a strap-on, he had to go all over the world and pretend he was president. So one of the things he was famous for was all these peace talks between Palestine and Israel. So at that time you had Ariel Sharon and, of course, the Palestinian Liberation Organization leader, Yasser Arafat. So Arafat and Sharon, both from these male-dominant patriarchal cultures, the Jews and the Arabs, and they're at these peace talks. And, by the way, people can look this up. They can vet this. When Clinton comes in to orchestrate these peace talks, he brings Chelsea with him. And so both Ariel Sharon and Yasser Arafat are appalled. And they said, why is this young prepubescent girl, what is she here? Why is she here? And, of course, Clinton says, because someday she's going to be president. So they both thought, the Bushes and the Clintons, it was going to work like this. They thought it was going to be Senior Bush, then Clinton, the Dick, and his nickname in government all the while he was in charge was Willie the Clit, by the way, basically as a sop to his wife who was really running the show. So then it was Bush Sr., then Willie the Clit, and then it was going to be basically George Bush Jr., and then it was going to be Hillary, and then it was going to be Jeb, and then it was going to be Chelsea. This is what they had arranged. They were just going to toss it back and forth to each other for 8 years in a row. 8 years Bill, 8 years George Bush Jr., 8 years Hillary, 8 years Jeb, and then 8 years Chelsea. That was what they had arranged. That was the deal they made. And it was so obvious because they were so chummy with each other. And it was so obvious because Gore lost. And when Gore lost, Bill and Hillary celebrated because they didn't want Gore to win. If Gore was going to win, then basically you would have had a Democrat in power. The economy was going to continue to slide. They would have blamed the Democratic Party, and then Hillary would never have gotten elected. So they made damn certain that the judge took the hanging chad and ruled against our man Gore. Of course, when I say our man, I'm not saying he's my man or your man, but what I'm saying is the election was his to lose. Basically, if things had gone naturally, everyone would have just voted Bush in because, Gore in because Bush Jr. had no sense of charisma, no sense of, he wasn't even articulate. And he was so drunk all the time, his wife was threatening to divorce him. By the way, that became public. That was just publicly known. As a matter of fact, one of the jokes that was running around was when Bush visited Iraq and that Turkish reporter threw the shoe at him, which he ducked. Everybody was making jokes in the White House about that's because he had so much practice from tucking all the shoes that his wife kept throwing at him because he was drunk all the time. Then he would get on the bike and he would trip. He'd be so drunk, he'd be falling off the bike all the time. She finally had to hide the bike because it happened 2 or 3 times in front of a camera. Anyhow, it was such a joke. But anyhow,
and this was during his presidency.
Yeah, that's during his presidency. and so, but anyhow, they thought they had it in the bag. But so Hillary called up Benazir Bhutto when she was running for president, and she thought she had it so in the bag because the deal she made with the man who ran the CIA, the man who was supposed to be part of a Freemasonic elite that went all the way back to the pharaohs. She said, I've gotten the bag, they'll be the next president. She called up Benazir Bhutto, you better leave London, get back to Pakistan, and run for the presidency, because as the princess with your background, if you become president over there and get elected, then I'll be backing you up and all this other good shit. And Benazir Bhutto went back to Pakistan. I told everybody, I said it on air, I said, she goes back to Pakistan, they're going to kill her. I said she killed 20,000 men. Every single one of their sons is going to be out to strap a bomb on himself and take her out. And of course, as soon as she got off the plane at the airport, 200 people died. I'm not kidding. 200 people died because some suicide bomber threw himself at her, blew up a whole bunch of people, but missed her. Then she got into the armored car. And when she got into the armored car, another suicide bomber threw himself under the armored car, blew himself up, and how she died was the impact of that suicide bomb from underneath the armored car was so intense that it threw her up against the roof of the armored ceiling of the armored car, and it shattered her brain. So what she died of was traumatic brain injury, a TBI, which is exactly what so many GIs have died of in Iraq due to IEDs or improvised explosive devices. She died like an American GI Joe. Basically, all these GIs in Iraq, the most common injury is traumatic brain injury, or TBI. And the reason for that is because of IEDs, or improvised explosive devices, which blow up underneath their armored vehicles, their Humvees. They bounce up against the armored ceiling, and they crack their brains out. And that's exactly how she died. And it was exactly as I predicted. She got torn apart, and everybody in the United States just said, oh, they killed her because she wears lipstick. Oh, they killed her because she's a woman. No, they killed her because she killed 20,000 men. So this is the kind of insanity of the people who run your world, and yet Hillary didn't win. Out of nowhere comes this Obama dude who's not even a U.S. citizen, and he's a president-elect, obviously. They put him in charge because he's the black man's white and the white man's black. Basically, he's neither. He's kind of like this horrible in-between where he's not really anything but an empty suit. And they put him in charge.
Let me jump in for a second, if I may, Douglas. What do you think about this new video that's out there proclaiming that Michelle is actually a man or a transvestite? Have you seen that?
I've heard about it, and basically, the only thing I can say about that would be, these days, almost nothing surprises me. With everything I'm bringing up to you now,
it's like they're trolling the population.
What's that?
I said it's like they're trolling the population. They're trolling the American people.
Oh, that might be giving them too much credit, but obviously, the question that comes to mind is, who is it that is so powerful that they were able to overcome whatever influence Bush and Clinton had at that time? Somebody obviously above the two of those families decided who was going to be president, and it wasn't going to be them anymore. And so they put in this guy with potentially the transvestite wife or the transgender wife. And personally, I don't see any reason to believe that. But were it true, honestly, with everything else I brought up so far, would that be any surprise? And in the end, what would it mean? It would be almost meaningless at this point. You've got a president who's not even a citizen, for God's sake. So what would it mean? We're in the era of degenerate Rome, the era of the foreign emperors. We're in the era of the black pharaohs of Egypt, in which towards the end, towards the Nubian pharaohocracy, where there were indeed black pharaohs that were ruling Egypt. Now, of course, it's important to emphasize there were black pharaohs at the beginning of Egyptians' climb to civilization, and there were black pharaohs at its end. So it's not a fact that they're black that has to do with the degeneracy of the Egyptian civilization towards the time when it was conquered by the Greeks and then the Romans. Rather, it emphasizes the fact that towards the end or the twilight of Egyptian civilization, they had an enormous amount of foreign emperors or emperors that would be considered foreign at that time. Now, that would include Obama, whether he was born in Indonesia or East Africa or Hawaii, because Hawaii is an illegally occupied kingdom. Anyone who doesn't believe me can look this up and find out for themselves. When the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor, they were striking Pearl Harbor because the Hawaiian queen, Liliuokalani, had been illegally overthrown by Dole, later of Dole dynasty, later of Senator Bob Dole fame. And that dynasty of Dole Pineapple made millions of dollars by basically setting up plantations after overthrowing the legitimate queen or monarchy of Hawaii, in that case, Queen Liliuokalani, and she asked through her Japanese accountant who was working for her and her estate where she was being held under house arrest till the day she died by U.S. Marines. She, through him, got the message out to Emperor Hirohito's father, Emperor Meiji, to rescue her kingdom and to liberate them from American occupation. If you look up what I'm saying, you'll also realize that at the time of December 7th of 1941, Hawaii was not a state. Hawaii wouldn't be a state until the 1950s, well after the Second World War ended. So at the time, it was an illegally occupied foreign nation which the Japanese were attempting to liberate from American occupation, and had every right to do so because it was requested by their legitimate leader who was being held illegally in house arrest by American Marines. So you've got this situation where Hawaii is an illegally occupied monarchy, a foreign nation. They've been asking for their monarchy back. Again, people can look this up online. Hawaiians have been requesting their kingdom back and for the United States to leave. And they're still doing that. So even if he was born in Hawaii, that doesn't make him a U.S. citizen because he was born in an illegally occupied foreign kingdom. So when you take all that into account, it doesn't matter. He's foreign. And so his rulership is a sign of illegitimacy and the decline, the decay of the American constitutional republic. We're entering our final phase. That's what he's representative of. So because of that, we are in a situation where who put him there? What put him there? That essentially is our military junta. Now, our military junta has been selecting presidents since 1876. And it's very important to remember, you do not have a constitutional republic other than in name only. Anyone who thinks that this is, by the way, and whoever uses the term democracy, like George Bush Jr. did, where he was referring to the world's largest democracy, India is the world's largest democracy, and they are a legitimate democracy, and it takes them down to the ground, not only because people vote for people who they consider to be gods, but because the Communist Party is legal in India, and wherever the Communist Party wins the votes, they totally they nationalize all of the industry, they make it illegal to accept investments from foreign nations, and they totally collectivize the economy. So you can go in one area of that subcontinent with over 1 billion people where they've got a capitalist market economy and people investing and everybody's doing telemarketing and answering phone calls whenever your computer breaks down. And, of course, they don't speak a word of English. They claim they do, but it's not English because you can't understand it. So they might as well be speaking Chickasaw. But at any rate, you've got that area, and you walk into another area just a few blocks away where the communists have won power, and they've collectivized the economy, and there's no investments, and there's no services, and so India is a basket case. That's a democracy. America doesn't have that, never did. It had a constitutional republic with this patina of a voting system, which, of course, was stolen by the military after the American Civil War between the states. And what happened then was, of course, the American Civil War between the states. You had a group of states legitimately secede based on the Articles of Confederation, where they were always given that right, and their issue was states' rights. In this case, the states' rights, unfortunately, to chattel slavery. Now, when these states seceded, the Union, illegally, said, we are going to take them back into the fold, and we're going to do it by force. All of this was done under Abraham Lincoln, who suspended habeas corpus and took anyone who was in a position of power who protested and put them in jail. And they were in jail until the day that a Confederate soldier blew Lincoln's brains out. So this man was not a president. He was a dictator. He was an American Stalin. And also, he freed the slaves, quote unquote, only in the South to start an insurgency, he hoped, behind Confederate lines. He did not free them in the North, where until a Confederate soldier blew his brains out, slavery was legal. Doesn't that just blow your mind? But no American knows about it. But at any rate, when Lincoln had his brains blown out, one of the men who was voted to replace him was a Democrat. He was a Republican. It's important to remember a Democrat was voted to replace him named Samuel Tilden. Samuel Tilden won the vote, both in terms of the popular vote and the electoral vote. He won the vote by a landslide. Now, in those days, the Democrats were the Dixiecrats. The Democrats were the party of the Klan. The Democrats were the party of the Old South. And how did this guy win? He won because everybody in the North, like everybody in the South, hated Abraham Lincoln, celebrated the fact that a Confederate soldier blew his brains out, and they knew that Abraham Lincoln was a dictator after years under his rule, in which millions of people died. Everybody said this was horrible, and they voted for somebody who was essentially the party of the very states which had tried to secede. So this was a great coming together of the United States, and the reason that Samuel Tilden won the presidency was because Samuel Tilden had fought against the corruption of the Northern generals. The Northern generals had looted the South in a genocidal campaign. They had taken all of this property from the great southern masses, porcelain, ancient furniture imported from China, etc., put it on the market, sold it all over the world, made themselves personal fortunes, and didn't pay any of the troops. Now, anyone who disbelieves may look up the Battle of Gettysburg. At the Battle of Gettysburg, generals were going around hat in hand, begging their troops to fight because they hadn't been paid for months. Now, this is how your military works. Your military works like this. Anyone who's a non-commissioned officer, from the rank of private all the way up to the rank of a warrant officer or a master sergeant or any of the technical classes of non-commissioned officers, the warrant officers, technical trainees, etc., if you're not getting paid, you don't have to fight. That's per Uniform Code of Military Justice. Now, if you're a commissioned officer, from the lowliest second lieutenant all the way up to a 5-star general, you have to fight, whether you're getting paid or not, because you own stock in the nation. You have signed over all of your personal investiture into the Incorporated States of America. You're a shareholder now. That means that as someone who owns stock in the nation, you have to fight for this nation till the moment it collapses. You no longer have a choice. You're part of the conspiracy. So the difference between the non-coms and the commissioned officers, that the commissioned officers are thoroughly corrupt and they are morally bankrupt. And this was never more evident than during the American Civil War between the states when the Union generals were looting everything, selling it, making themselves into millionaires, and establishing family dynasties where they made so much money that they could basically support generations down the line of power. And these nouveau riche mofos didn't even pay their troops. Didn't give them a Lincoln penny, or at that point it was an Indian head penny. They were squeezing that so hard that the Indian was sweating. And all these troops were going for months without pay. And so at Gettysburg, all of these Union generals going around, oh, please, we can't pay you. We haven't paid you in months, but we got to appeal to your patriotism to bring your errant brothers back into the fold for a grand experiment in union. And these non-commissioned troops and officers, sergeants, etc., were so stupid, so naive, so indoctrinated and brainwashed that they went for it. And they won the day at the Battle of Gettysburg, and they lost their freedom forever. Because after that Civil War was brought to a close, then what happened was the South, evidently winning in a cultural sense, got their president in, and fortunately, Samuel Tilden's vote was stolen. Because all of the industrial barons got together and they said, hey, we can't have this war end because we made so much money. It was a railroad war. Every single major battle in the American Civil War between the states took place within 10 to 20 miles of track. So it was a railroad war, and the railroad robber barons had won themselves the industry and the economy of the United and Confederate States. And they said, we've got to get these generals to declare war on the Plains Indians and expand west so we could bring these rails all the way to the Pacific. And they had already set up deals with Japan so they could build a railhead and a rail link between Japan and Korea. And they're so close, Japan and Korea are so close that if you drink a beer on a Korean beach and throw it in the water, it'll wash up on a Japanese beach. And that happens all the time. You go to beaches in Japan, you see these Korean soda pop cans and beer cans floating up on the beach, and it's written in the Korean language. You know they're from Korea, right across the street. That's how close they are. A healthy man could swim the distance. So they were going to build a railhead connecting Korea to Japan, which would then connect to Manchuria and the Trans-Siberian Railways, all run by American investors and stockholders and shareholders, and they would run the world economy in Asia and into Russia. And so they said the only way we can do this is if the Frontier Army declares wars on the Plains Indians, kills them all, and we expand the rails using illegal Chinese immigrant labor, all these coolies they were importing, and we can get this job done only if we establish a military junta. So they took their man, a Republican named Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a general, very important to remember, and General Rutherford B. Hayes was a guerrilla in a suit. He was infamous for killing his own men with his bare hands. So here's General Rutherford B. Hayes, and somehow this man becomes your 19th president because they stole the electoral vote using bribery, using threats, and all of this was admitted by men who later on didn't get the positions they were promised. So it's a matter of historical record and fact that the United States military ran up a pirate flag over your republic over 100 years ago, and exactly 100 years after the foundation of that republic in 1776, in the year 1876, they ran up a pirate flag and they put General Rutherford B. Hayes to back up the industry in charge, and this is where the term came from, military-industrial complex. So when Rutherford B. Hayes took over both the Confederate and the Union states, the Confederates rebelled. They said, we're going to go to war again. And Rutherford B. Hayes says, oh, no. I'm going to set up the compromise where you guys can do whatever you want down south, and I'm pulling out the Union Army. So he withdrew the Union Army, set up the Great Compromise of 1877, and gave the South back over to the white elite, the Klan, and the Old Riche, and they were able to gerrymander all of the districts in a predominantly black population base where all of the Deep South is overwhelmingly African American. They were able to gerrymander all of the counties so that all the votes would come in favor of the white power structure. And they were able to maintain the culture of the antebellum South for a good many decades after that, thanks to the Great Compromise of 1877 and the end of Reconstruction, as it was called, under the Lincoln dictatorship. So basically what was set up was a white power kind of brokerage between the League of the North, the League of the South. Compromise was made, and everybody started expanding west. And the majority of the Frontier Army was consisted of Confederate veterans. So you've got the situation where they expanded the rails based on illegal labor, illegal immigrants from China, and the person who voted against or vetoed Congress's act to stop illegal immigration from Asia, the person who voted against it was, of course, the illegal president-elect, not a president-elect, but a president-elect, Rutherford B. Hayes. By the way, all the votes they stole were electoral. They couldn't steal the majority votes of popular votes. So they stole the electoral votes, and they got him into power by stealing the electoral votes in Florida, exactly where Bush Jr. won, and in Louisiana. And by swinging these southern votes, the electoral votes in those massive southern states, New Orleans, by the way, was the de facto capital of the South many years after the American Civil War between the states. It's also the largest port in the world. Every single tanker coming from Mexico, Venezuela, Nigeria, many of these other places in the world go to New Orleans. It's the largest port in the world, so large, as a matter of fact, that one science fiction author, Stanley G. Weinbaum, portrayed New Orleans as the capital of planet Earth. That's how large a city it was in its day, still is in a very big way. So you've got this area where they were able to swing these electoral votes and get this man in power by one vote. They stole the election, got him in power by one single electoral vote. And since that period of time, you've never had an elected president. Every single president you've ever had has been a president selected by the general. Your people who run your country are your American military. Anyone who doesn't believe this, think about the numbers I gave you. I told you less than 1% of your population base is in the military. With sequestration going on and they're cutting down the military, you've got less than that. You've got, just comparatively speaking, about a little over 0.5% maybe that is in your military. Yet every single year, without fail, they get over 50% of your federal discretionary budget income. every year, without fail. Less than 1%
Right.
of your population gets well over 50%. Doesn't go to senior care, doesn't go to health care, doesn't go to education, doesn't go to anything other than these bastards, these mofos, that do absolutely nothing with it other than glut themselves as a military mafia. None of it goes towards veterans benefits. That means the non-commissioned. The non-commissioned people are dirt to the commissioned officers. It's all the commissioned officers mafia. You've got to totally deconstruct your commissioned officer class. You've got to, by the way, and they're all traitorous. And when I say they're all traitorous, here's the best example. When John F. Kennedy became president, and he's still, by the way, the youngest president we've ever had. He was younger than Obama when he became president. When John F. Kennedy became president, he said, I need to know our national security situation. So the men who told him what our national security situation was, the men responsible, primarily the Strategic Air Command, were all, of course, Air Force officers, and the Air Force was, from the beginning, a criminal organization. Basically, you have a situation of mass murderers. All of the people who were involved with Strategic Air Command were originally involved with strategic bombing. Now, where did that concept come from? Basically, you're talking about the elite skull and bones men who comprised what was called the Millionaires Club in World War I. Now, if you look back to World War I, there were two types of American volunteers going overseas. We're not talking about when America became involved in World War I legally after the sinking of the Lusitania. That was in the last year of the war. When the Lusitania was sunk in 1917, then the United States officially declared war on Imperial Germany. They traveled overseas, and the war ended in disaster for everyone in 1918 because the Americans brought with them the American Army Plague, which comes down in history as the Spanish Plague. Now, all of this was biowarfare. It was all incepted in Kansas, in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And how that was incepted was, of course, they drafted a bunch of conscripts from right here in the state of California out of San Quentin. They took these conscripts out of San Quentin and they shipped them in unrefrigerated boxcars with live chicken all the way to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. And that entire amount of exposure to all of that particulate fecal matter from the chicken cages gave them what was known as chicken wool. That chicken wool produced what became hemagglutinin-1 neuromodase 1. That's an artificial inception through this incubation of H1N1, the avian swine flu. And so this avian swine flu was contracted by all these GIs. They were able to get what they called a primary patient who became a vector for that disease. His name was William Gitchell. And William Gitchell, they made the cook because he contracted the disease. It didn't kill him, and he became a carrier. And when they made him the cook for the entire camp, he spread it to everyone else. And then the Surgeon General, Gorgas, Gorgas, he made all the troops sleep together. Now, people can look this up and see photographs of this. Instead of isolating all of the troops, as anyone would normally do for a virus, they had them all sleep together. And so they turned them into carriers of biological warfare. By the time they shipped them off to Spain, a nominally neutral nation, so they could disembark and then invade France, they arrived in what were called coffin ships, because the majority of the doughboys who arrived in World War I arrived dead. But those that lived carried the avian swine flu, and worldwide, they killed 100 million people. 100 million people died. They killed more people in 24 hours than AIDS killed in 24 years. Think about what I'm saying. When the Americans landed in Europe, they killed more people in 24 hours than AIDS killed in 24 years. They killed more people in a single year than the Black Plague killed in 100 years. They killed more people in 1918 than the Black Plague wiped out in a century. That was the ultimate bioweapon. That's what ended World War I. And so before then, you had nothing but American volunteers overseas. So these American volunteers overseas, what were they? Well, there were two types. The poor boys, who were extremely talented, wanted to learn how to fly. One of them was Charles Augustus Lindbergh. wasn't necessarily that poor, but he definitely went with a bunch of other American volunteers and flew in the Escadrille Lafayette, which was the French flying version of the French Foreign Legion. And they fought against the Germans on the side of the French for years before the Americans sent over their American Army flew vectoring doughboys. Now, there was another unit that people can look up, they can do their own research on this, called the Millionaires Club. And the Millionaires Club were all skull and bones men. And all the skull and bones men were so decadent that they went to war because this was the sport of kings. They went to war to kill for fun because it was a version of hunting for them. And anyone who doubts this tradition can look at Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was a man who not necessarily was a skull and bones man, but during the Spanish-American War was part of that American cultural elite of wealthy individuals who organized private armies. Now, all of the regular army at that point in history was overwhelmingly black. And, of course, these rich white guys who wanted to partake in the Spanish-American War and kill people for fun, they said, well, we ain't going to serve with no niggers. That's what they said. So they said, we'll organize our own army. So they hired their own mercenary armies of thugs and created things like the Rough Rider unit. And they went down and fought in the Spanish-American War in the easy areas like Cuba and the Bahamas and all these Spanish holdings in the Caribbean. None of them went to the Philippines. That's where they sent all the poor boys. So all the poor white trash they drafted went into the Philippines. All the poor black trash, as they considered it, was serving in the regular army. They just brought down the Caribbean to do all the fighting, and they would clean up and take all the credit in what they called hunting expeditions. Now, all of these actions that you see, Don Juan Hill, which was originally named Tea Kettle Hill, but they changed the name for the sake of sounding better for the papers, all that was taken by all black units. And then the Rough Riders, Roosevelt and his boys, would go up there and take all the credit. And they would take the flag from the black units and wave it for the cameras. That's how corrupt these bastards were. Well, take a look at the uniforms. All their uniforms will say USV. What the hell is that? And the officers will say USGV. What is that? It's not United States Army. They're not legal units. All of their uniforms for these white guys in Cuba and all these areas, they say USV because that stands for United States Volunteer. And the USGV for the officers is United States Gentleman Volunteer. So the officers were buying their own mercenary armies like Blackwater, and these were the prototypes, and just going down there and hunting down people for fun. Now, who were they hunting down? Well, there had been hundreds of American families that had left the United States and reestablished themselves in these Spanish areas where they bought land from Spain and set up their own plantations. So what happened was all of these were U.S. citizens who lived overseas and decided that they were going to live a lifestyle that they couldn't live back in the United States, many of them taking their black slaves with them after the fall of the South, reestablishing their plantations and their families in Cuba and these other areas. That's who the Rough Riders were hunting down. So they hunted down a lot of these United States American emigres and exterminated entire families. Now, this was exposed because it was all brought back to Congress that all these war crimes had been committed by these white mercenary units when the black troops came home and reported these war crimes. So when Congress brought it up before themselves, they couldn't put any of these rich white boys in jail. So they decided any United States citizen who's living overseas in time of war becomes instantly an enemy of the United States. Now, nobody in the U.S. knows this, but this is the law. It was ruled by the Supreme Court of the United States and through Congress, acts of Congress, that if you're a U.S. citizen, if you buy property overseas, you settle in Costa Rica, you settle anywhere else, you're living there, if suddenly you're there and the United States declares war on that nation, you automatically lose your citizenship in the United States and you're declared an instant enemy and you will be mowed down and no one will be punished for it. Your family can be raped, ravished, burned alive, which is what they did to a lot of these people, and they got away with it. And so that is the situation that you're under. By the way, that was brought home to the United States in World War II. There were at least 300 Italians that we know of who were overseas. There were thousands and thousands, but there were at least 300 that were captured as a unit. And this is because they were overseas as students, visiting their families when World War II got started, and the United States said, you all lose your citizenship now, just like in the Spanish-American War. You're all the enemies. We're going to kill you all. And so they lost their citizenship. They had no home. They had no other choice. They went into the Italian army because at that point they were no longer Americans. Later on, they got captured, and they tried to establish that they were American citizens. A great example was a Los Angeles woman who instituted habeas corpus proceedings in an effort to keep her son. His name was Gaetano Tarito. And she wanted to keep him in the United States instead of being deported come 1945, 46, 47. And she based her appeal on the grounds that he was an American citizen born in West Virginia, that he was not legally a prisoner of war. And it went all the way up to the Ninth Circuit of California Court of Appeals, where he was being kept prisoner. This is how I had access to the records at the Presidio military base. And the Supreme Court of the state of California said Tarito was a prisoner of war, that neither American citizenship or his presence in an Italian service unit affected that status, and under the terms of the Geneva Convention, it was incumbent on the United States to deport him to Italy and mark him as a terrorist the rest of his life. Now, this decision was based on Americans residing in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. So the court ruled that residents in any enemy country, regardless of their citizenship, are enemies. Now, because thousands of Japanese Americans were incarcerated, interned, entire families during World War II, many of them not far here in California from where Gaetano Tarito was working in the West Coast as a prisoner of war who was forced to pick fruit like they do illegal immigrants today. They used all these prisoner of wars as slave labor without pay for the California Farmers Association and many other states. Basically, they pointed out that the converse of this argument, that if you're on friendly soil, regardless of your citizenship, would that make you a friend? No. The Supreme Court decided you're an enemy, whether you're abroad or at home. Do you understand the consequences of what I'm saying? Because they took the U.S. citizenship away from all the Japanese, and they held it as constitutional. By the way, this went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they said that was constitutional decades later. What they are saying is that you are an enemy whether you are abroad or at home. So if you're a U.S. citizen, it doesn't matter. Whether you live here or you live overseas, you're the enemy. Do you get what I'm saying? That means that there's only two people in the United States, the military and you. And that less than 1% of the population gets all your discretionary income that they can grab, and you're their enemy. So you're occupied. You're an occupied nation, people. Get over it. Wake up.
You know, and let's get into that even more. You've got the Patriot Act in 2001. We had the opportunity to interview Susan Lindauer, which is a former CIA asset, basically, and she got locked up under the Patriot Act because she, under what her testimony is she exposed that there was no serious weapons of mass destruction in Iraq to some top brass, and she was locked away for 5 years. And now she comes out and says, hey, look, you know, I was former CIA, and they locked me up because I was trying to say, hey, look, we don't need to go to war in Iraq or whatever. So if they're willing to do that to their own people, what they call their own people, it's, you know, the average citizen's right. They have absolutely no rights whatsoever. And let me ask you this, Douglas, and then I'd like to hopefully get into the military's infiltration with Satanism, the Church of Set, Michael Aquino. Maybe we could talk about that a little bit and how that's permeating through society today. Where would you go with that as far as the information that you saw and what you went through? How did you even get involved with Michael Aquino and that stuff?
Thank you very much for asking. And to just kind of round off and close what we were talking about, it's important to remember that the executive commander-in-chief, who, by the way, of course, is illegally so, Barack Hussein Obama, he was questioned about drone strikes. and the potential of drone strikes against American citizens. Now, as far as I understand it, unless anyone can correct me on this, there have been a few drone strikes against American citizens in the United States. This has occurred. So, and there are certain, there was a journalist, for instance, who, I'm trying to remember, he was, thank you, that was the man who died on the highway, right?
Yep, the heart attack done, they think.
Yeah, well, with that, the one where his car disintegrated in motion while people were watching, right?
Was that Walker? Was that Paul Walker, the media guy?
Well, one of them. The car basically blew into flames, and what people claimed that they saw was a drone strike. That basically his car was hit in motion by a drone while he was on the freeway. That's what some people were claiming. But regardless, certain people also as well. There was another African American cop who had gone haywire, had killed some people, went hiding in his cabin, and his cabin was burned down with him in it. And they said that he had set himself on fire and the cabin on fire and burned alive. And by the way, Jason says it was Paul Walker. That's probably who we're talking about, who died in a car, potentially by a drone strike. Another potential drone strike was what took down the cabin of that African-American cop, whose name I forget. He killed a few cops, wrote this long, bizarre, rambling manifesto, went to hide in a cabin in the woods, got burned alive. And probably the fire was started by a drone. Now, President Barack Hussein Obama, who was interviewed about these potential drone strikes or the use of drones on American citizens, said that he was doing so on legal precedent, that he had legal grounds on which to conduct these strikes. Now, again, it's important to reemphasize the fact that many of these strikes are called Obama strikes, what would normally be called executive strikes. In other words, an executive order for a direct kill or a direct hit or a targeted assassination, what they used to call executive action, if you've ever heard that term. So in the case of Barack Hussein Obama, he is talking about executive action or Obama strikes. And so he says that he's doing all this legally. And so he said this on air. And this was long before NDAA, because that's what he was being questioned about, the National Defense Authorization Act. So people were questioning about, would NDAA give you the ability to conduct drone strikes against Americans that you would consider terrorists? And he said, no, I can do that without the NDAA on the basis of legal precedent. So when you got to take into account that a lot of these legal pieces of paper that they just keep churning out, they're meaningless. They're just keeping bureaucrats paid and fed because they've got their asses sitting in a courthouse or in some government facility all day long. They have nothing to do. So they just churn out more and more laws. We must have 40,000 laws at the absolute least, that the majority of which are unenforceable. Nobody knows about them. But all of this is just keep bureaucrats fat and happy and fed.
And it looks like they're doing something. They're protecting the people.
Yeah, well, I don't even think they bother with that. I don't even think they bother with making it look good anymore. But reality is that their ability to do anything they want to you was decided from Lincoln to Wilson to Roosevelt. And basically, those three presidents in particular have stolen whatever sovereignty or freedom any one of you might have once had as a U.S. citizen. At this point in life, your U.S. citizenship is a negative. It is far more of a negative than it is a positive, because unlike an illegal immigrant who can leech off benefits and get medical care, etc., for free, plus educate your kids, you can't do any of that. You're paying for it, plus you're supporting the military men who are bringing in the illegal immigrants. Now think about what I said going back to the history of where it all started. Where did it all start? It all started with the Asian illegal immigrants that were being shipped in under the railroad barons by the brute force, backed up by their general president. That president, who was a general, their president-elect, Rutherford B. Hayes, who vetoed Congress's decisions to try and block illegal immigration from Asia. So they kept bringing them in to support the rail barons, cheap labor, wage slave labor, and they continue to do so today. And so who are the people responsible for this? Your military. And it's your military, and what do they live off of? Your tax dollars. So what does your United States citizenship mean? Your U.S. citizenship means that you exist simply so you can pay for the military to bring in illegal immigrants, which you support, so that you can keep paying the military so that they can live fat and happy, and all of this while you're an enemy of their junta. You are considered an enemy, and because they occupy your nation, then they just tax you, soak you, and continue to occupy you, and they can kill you anytime they want. Anytime they want.
It's like something out of a horror movie meets science fiction. It's, you brought up a point a minute ago that I was thinking about earlier, where all these new bills are passed every single year that strip people of more of their rights, but you brought up a very good point. It doesn't matter. They could do whatever they want anyway. They don't need it.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. But to put it back into perspective, when I'm talking about this, to give you an idea of what kind of a mafia they are, the United States Army Air Corps, during World War II, there was no such thing as an Air Force. The Germans had an Air Force. They had the Luftwaffe. The British had an Air Force. They had the Royal Air Force. Every nation in the world that was advanced enough to train men and put them in the air in units had essentially at least a legitimately named Air Force. There were only two nations on Earth that did not have an Air Force that were considered developed or industrialized. One was Japan, because they divided all of their air assets into naval aviation and army aviation. The other one was the United States. There was naval aviation, and there was the United States Army Air Corps. But there was no Air Force until 1947. That's how the CIA got control of a lot of these records, was because the United States Army created them, as well as the Air Force, to basically take over what was formerly an Army base, what we know as Nellis Air Force Base, also as Area 51. They're all interconnected underground in what is generically known as Dreamland. All of that area was once Tonopah Army Airfield. Now, Tonopah Army Airfield was given over to two agencies, the Air Force and the Central Intelligence Agency, who act in co-dominion to co-administer that test area and everything that's hidden there. Now, these agencies were created to hide the reality behind war crimes or atrocities like the Roswell incident, but also they were created so that a bunch of mass murderers could get together and start a traveling golf club at your expense. This is where the treason comes in that I need to bring up about Kennedy. Basically, the United States Air Force, to give you an idea of how corrupt and how truly evil and mercenary these people were, a lot of people are aware of the mass firebombing that they conducted during World War II. Many people are unaware that this mass firebombing was conducted in such a manner as to kill many Americans. Now, a good example of this was Hiroshima. When the Hiroshima bomb was dropped, a lot of people have asked, well, why was the Hiroshima bomb dropped on Hiroshima? What was the decision for choosing that target? Well, the specific reason for choosing it was because there were 2,000 United States citizens there. Basically, it was known that 2,000 Japanese Americans who were home in Japan, visiting their families, studying abroad, were stranded overseas when the war started. And they were all gathered into Hiroshima, and they were considered a military asset that was threatening to the United States because they spoke perfect English as well as Japanese, and were almost certainly being pressed into service to translate any intercepted communiques between United States and Allied forces, as well as United States services amongst themselves. So for that reason, they targeted Hiroshima so that they could kill not only those 2,000 U.S. citizens of Japanese ancestry, but the many prisoners of war that were there that they figured were being press-ganged into the same sort of services. So to eliminate them being interrogated for further information, etc., or Japanese interpreters from serving their duty, they basically had already stripped their Japanese of their citizenship, by the way. See, these people didn't have a choice. They were overseas. A war got started. Their citizenship was stripped. They were declared instantly as enemies. They had no choice but to basically stay where they were at and serve the nation they were in because the United States rejected them. And then the United States killed them for it. So the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. That's one example of mass murder of your own citizens overseas intentionally. And then the United States Army Air Corps also did that with foreign nations. Great example of this was Operation Halyard. Operation Halyard was the largest rescue operation ever conducted concerning overseas American MIA missing in action that was ever conducted. And it was conducted in the Balkans and Eastern Europe. The Americans had tried to bomb Romania, where the Plovdiv oil fields served as the major source of oil and petroleum for the Third Reich. Now, the Americans, of course, flew all of these bombers very low to the ground to bomb these oil facilities. They didn't ever dream that the Germans had set up the 88, the anti-tank cannon and anti-aircraft cannon, basically high up in the air on turrets and towers well above the level at which these bombers were flying. So all the Germans would do was point down and shoot. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. So all these slow-flying American bombers came in, got massacred, and the Americans lost something like thousands of airmen, and of course about 600 parachuted to the ground, made it down alive, and were suddenly lost behind enemy lines. Well, the Serbs, who were serving as a resistant population, an indigenous population, this is very similar to Vietnam, where the Special Forces Green Berets, of which Michael Aquino, who you mentioned, was a part of, the Special Forces Green Berets were trained as force multipliers. They were trained to go behind enemy lines and multiply the capability of friendly indigenous populations to resist enemy occupation. So in terms of the Serbs, they were doing that on their own. They were resisting the Axis powers, and they smuggled all of these Americans out of that area to a pickup point where the Americans could be rescued by their own forces. So about 600 Americans were rescued, a score of Britons, and as soon as they came back to headquarters, they were ordered to turn around and bomb the Serbs. Why? Because the Americans had been bribed by the Roman Catholic Church. Very important to remember that there were two sides in the Yugoslav conflict in the Balkans at that period of time. The Croatians had sided with the Axis, and the Croatians, of course, were ardently Catholic as opposed to the Serbians, who were Byzantine Orthodox. And the Croatians, of course, they had an Italian king, the Duke of Spoleto, who had established his kingdom there under Axis rule. They had an Ustashi, or a Vatican fascist government, and they had exterminated a great deal of the Serbian population that was in Croatia. As a matter of fact, the only death camps or concentration camps, Koncentrationen, set up specifically for children were run by Croatian Catholic nuns in Dubno and Lovnik in Greater Croatia. So you had a situation of a very harshly imposed Vatican state-run regime in Croatia, and the Vatican paid an enormous amount of Vatican gold to the United States Army Air Corps to bomb their own allies instead of the Axis, and the United States Army Air Corps went for it. So on Serbian Orthodox Easter, they basically flew in when everybody was attending church in the capital, Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, and they killed 20,000 Serbs. And these were the same airmen who had just been rescued by those very people. That shows you the quality of airmen that the United States puts in the air. These are people who you must never help. You must consider them your natural biological enemy, and to really throw this home for you. Basically, this strategic bombing they were all conducting, where they were killing all of these people at Dresden and various other areas. Great example of that, Kurt Vonnegut Jr. He wrote a book called Slaughterhouse-Five. He was an American of Jewish ethnicity. He was drafted into the war or volunteered, and he served overseas. And he was taking a big risk, because if he were ever taken prisoner by the Germans, as he ultimately was, they could have interpreted him two ways, either as an American or as a Jew. And if he was interpreted to be a Jew, he could have been sent to the camps. But he was interpreted as an American, so he was kept with the rest of the American prisoners of war. And, of course, they brought thousands of British, Polish, Russian, as many Allied prisoners of war they could round up, French, etc. They brought them into Dresden because Dresden was an ancient cultural city and it was a major logistical hub, and they felt that they could use all of these prisoners as human shields. Well, the Americans and the Brits didn't care about all of their allies and prisoners of war being in Dresden. They bombed it anyway. So at that point, there was no room to keep any of these prisoners. There was no real facilities. So Kurt Vonnegut Jr., along with many Americans, wound up being stuck in a slaughterhouse. And during the Dresden firebombing, he barely escaped with his life when the slaughterhouse came burning down, barely escaped from the city, barely made it back to Allied lines. And then he tried to write a book about it, and no one would publish it. So Kurt Vonnegut Jr., who's a very well-known author, mostly writes science fiction. One of the things that started him on that was he said, well, if I can't get anyone to publish this, I'll put it into science fiction. And so he wrote about it as science fiction. So if you ever read the novel Slaughterhouse 5, he talks about his actual experience in Dresden in that novel. As a matter of fact, he put it into a movie. If you ever watch the 1970s film Slaughterhouse 5, there's a scene where the main character, who's basically Kurt Vonnegut Jr., wakes up in a hospital with amnesia, barely remembering anything except a few traumatic experiences. And somebody in the bed next to him is writing a book, writing something, and the nurse says, hey, what are you doing? And that guy in the bed next to him says, I'm writing a book about the Dresden firebombing. And his main character in that film says, I was at Dresden. I survived the firebombing. Then the guy turns around to him and says, well, write your own damn book. Well, that was the whole attitude all Americans had towards all of these Americans being killed and all of these allies being killed by American bombing. But it gets worse. These people are so criminal that when Kennedy became president and he basically said, I want to know the national security situation, the Americans were well aware that the Soviet Union had capabilities and what capabilities it lacked because they'd been doing overflights with the U-2 spy plane and low-level satellite surveillance and even live astronaut surveillance through Project Odysseus, America's covert reserve astronaut space program. So the Americans had plenty of photographs and in-depth working knowledge of the Soviet war machine. And basically, all of this was accumulated under the administration of a General Eisenhower, himself a military veteran of the war. So when Kennedy came into power after Truman and Eisenhower, the Strategic Air Command got in front of him and they said, here's the situation, Mr. President. And they pointed to all of these satellite reconnaissance photographs and U-2 pictures, all this stuff. And they pointed to every single church spire, every single war memorial, every single grain silo. And they said, Mr. President, every single one of these objects you see is an intercontinental ballistic missile on its launching pad ready to launch. And they said the Soviet Union has 1,500 missiles that are intercontinental in capability and can hit us at any moment. We've got an enormous missile gap, and you've got to give us billions of dollars so we can catch up. So he turned over billions of dollars, and all that time the Strategic Air Command knew that the Soviet Union had 4. Count them. Fucking 4. Less than the number of fingers on your left or right hand intercontinental ballistic missiles. That's all the Soviet Union had. And they knew it. And they lied to their commander-in-chief so he could give them billions of your tax dollars and they could build bases all over the world in which they could house the U.S. Air Force. Now, you know what the entire layout plan for any Air Force base is as part of its integral defenses, part of its in-depth defenses that they must have, even if it's just what the CIA would refer to as a lily pad or just a single helicopter pad. Every single Air Force base, any installation affiliated with the Air Force as part of its primary defense has to have a golf course.
Golf course.
That's right. So they are a traveling golf course. These men are traitors. They should everybody who was in that room with Kennedy, everybody who plotted deceiving him of the Strategic Air Command, the entire Strategic Air Command's high command, because they were all conspiracy to this, they should have all been taken out, lined up against the wall, and publicly shot. Because they're traitors.
It's a stressful job, Douglas. I mean, come on, man. You got to fly around the world. You got to play golf. You got to have something to do, right?
Yeah, there you go. Well, and now, of course, they don't field functionally, for all intents and purposes, a single warplane that dismantled their self-bomber fleet. They're all underground in these stupid missile silos, working with missiles that they know are not going to work. And of course, they were so confident of this that they basically have been public about it. It's gone public now. People can again look this up, that our missile forces, our strategic rocket forces are decades old. The majority of them, they know for a fact if they press the button to launch, the majority of them are going to blow in their silos, if they blow at all. And it doesn't matter. They still keep getting your money. So we've got to dismantle your officer class and your military. You've got to get rid of it. And everybody says, well, we have to defend ourselves. That's why you're a nation of gun owners. I mean, at this point, you've got to realize that your military is no longer, or never was, a defense. That this is the greatest threat you're facing. It's your military. Get rid of it. They're an occupation force. They are an enemy. They're an enemy occupation force. They consider you the enemy. You may as well return the favor and say, I'm not going to give them any more money. And just say, I'm going to pay taxes, but I want my taxes to go into anything, healthcare, education, anything but the military. But why did Congress keep giving them so much? That's where we get back to the Satanism. Here's the whole point. When the military junta took over the United States, of course, they wanted to get more and more money, so they said, well, how do we do it? And so they set up what was called a super soldier program. Now, your super soldier program has nothing to do with super soldiers. These aren't bigger, better Captain Americas. They're not brawnier, grain-fed human cows that are running around on the battlefield. These are basically what the U.S. Army refers to as queer hordes. Horrible name. And that is basically something that they set up by going to all of these orphanages, all of these various boy towns, and they basically recruit, if you can call it that, these younger kids into various programs where they turn them into serial killers or sleeper agents who basically get in bed, literally with politicians, and get to know the layout of their estate, their ranches, their New York City apartment houses and complexes, and they know how to take them out anytime, and they take photographs in compromising positions with them, and it's all this blackmail that nets them over 50% of your fiscal discretionary income every single year. So that is why Congress always votes to give them all the money. So all of this falls under the purview of course, a pedopocracy. But where does the Satanism come in? Satanism comes in from a very real belief on the part of these military men that mass sacrifice imbues them with the ability to draw in entities that feed off pain, human suffering, and that they can channel these entities, that they can harness them, that they can lock them in place and bind them. And that is what led to the research into some highly experimental electromagnetic technologies, which of course brings us to garrisons like the Gakona, Alaska complex of HARP, which they recently said they were going to dismantle. And that seemed logical enough because they've got so many of those installations worldwide now that the dismantling of one extremely well-known and information hemorrhaging site looked like it made sense. But now they're changing their mind on even that. Now, HARP, of course, these facilities the world over are powerful enough where they can generate artificial auroras. So you've got a situation in which, what does all that energy go for? Because none of it is really being used to cause earthquakes. You cannot cause an earthquake with a HARP mechanism. A HARP can be used passively to scan earthquake fault lines, but this would be done through extension kinds of vehicles or surveillance of such areas. It's not the HARP mechanism that can do it from Gakona, Alaska, or any other sites or facilities. So they're not really used for either earthquake fault detection or tremor detection, and they're not really used to cause or generate earthquakes because that's not what they're capable of. Electromagnetic pulsation does that. Totally different mechanism developed by Nikola Tesla many, many years ago. So what is HARP used for? If you ever take a look online, the University of Tokyo monitors HARP. And they have the display of their monitoring system up where you can access it. And the University of Tokyo has been monitoring HARP since its construction because they knew its original intent, which was to reverse the jet stream, which is one of the ways that Japan won the war, using the jet stream to convey balloon bombs into the United States to start enormous fires, and what they would have ultimately have used to deploy biocidal biological weapons to wipe out the American population the way the Americans had wiped out so much of the world in World War I if the Americans didn't sue for peace. So the Americans, of course, knew that the jet stream only went in one direction, from Japan to the United States, which is why Fukushima carries all the way over here in terms of its radiation.
Right.
So the Americans decided that they needed to develop a way to reverse the jet stream. Now, HAARP can do that. HAARP is powerful enough to reverse the jet stream, but that's not what it's used for. They were able to do it once or twice, so why don't they use it to do that all the time? Well, aside from the hellishly expensive and monstrous amount of energy it would take, there would be no purpose in that they could think of or would care about. Rather, they're using it as a passive binding mechanism for entities that they feel that they've drawn in through all of the mass ritual sacrifices they have conducted through all their strategic bombing in particular. And in this day and age, it's turned into drone strikes, the use of depleted uranium, all the pain and suffering that they cause by nonstop, endless states of warfare. Now, how is it that when we've got a population of less than 1% of our baseline population in the military, how is it we can wage all these wars? I mean, how do we do it? We occupy, there's like 160 nations recognized by the United Nations. The majority of them are occupied by the United States. Now, is this done because we have the greatest troops in the world? Far from it. The United States has the worst military in the world. I mean, anyone who thinks otherwise is living in a fantasy. They are living off of Rambo films and just a state of dreamlike wannabe wish fulfillment that has nothing to do with reality. Anyone who thinks that we have a military that's even capable of fighting is basically, you got to give it up. That's not the case. So what keeps us occupying these other nations? Basically, we are operating with supernatural warfare. And what happened, of course, was you take a look at Aquino's last conflict was the same Gulf War I served in. Now, in terms of his cabal, his Temple of Set, and the Satanism, which he was the officially recognized chaplain for in the United States military, Colonel Michael Aquino, of course, converted many other officers into the fold of the Temple of Set. So many, as a matter of fact, that he wrote the Chaplain's Handbook. Anyone who disbelieves this, vet it yourself. You can search engine what I'm talking about. The Chaplain's Handbook that all of the Christian, Buddhist, any other Jewish, any other school of theological philosophy, all of those chaplains are subservient to the satanic chaplain. Because the man who wrote the Chaplain's Handbook for the United States Army was the officially recognized satanic chaplain of the United States Army himself, Colonel Michael Angelo Aquino. And Michael Aquino wrote that so that all other chaplains would be aware of and know not to interfere with satanic rites of sacrifice or mutilation or animal extermination and extinguishment, anything that would take place under the auspices of the satanic chaplaincy, that none of the Jews or Christians or Catholics or Buddhists or anyone else could interfere with. They were all made aware of the extent of these rituals, the existence of them, and to exercise a policy of non-interference. So this was a book that was written by Colonel Aquino on contract with the United States Department of Defense, specifically the U.S. Army, after his retirement. So that really goes to show you the power of the satanic chaplaincy. He basically is still recognized as the pope, if you will, of that movement within the Army until he dies. Like a pope, he holds that position till he dies, and then someone else replaces him. So even though he's retired from the Army, he is still in service as their satanic chaplain. There are many others within the Army, but they obey the chain of command of which he is in charge. Now, in terms of what he was working with, one of the things that he was working with in terms of sacrifice was prior to the Gulf War, where it took him months to put together enough of the rituals to summon entities that drove all of the Iraqi troops into stark raving madness, fear, and full retreat. And in terms of what he was contending with, he was conducting sacrifices in the field. Many people, of course, are totally unaware of the fact that it took us 9 months, in Operation Desert Shield to mobilize the largest gathering or coalition of Marines that ever was mobilized in the history of the United States. More than for the Battle of Guadalcanal or Tarawa or any of the Pacific battles, we had more Marines accumulated from all over the world, and we're the world's largest elite force. Were gathered in Al-Iraq through Operation Desert Storm, and it took 9 months to gather that, all the Army divisions, all this period of time. Why were they taking so long? It was like childbirth. And you have to ask, that was so vulnerable. All of our positions strung out, waiting for strikes from Farahin Hussein, but he was contending with an enormous amount of sightings of paranormal entities, reports of ghosts, demons, the jinn, and much of this was being called up by Aquino and his minions. To give you an example of this, for people who don't understand, one of his co-religionists is a man named, at the time he was Lieutenant Colonel, Timothy Challums, Challums, not James Channon, who was the founder of the 1st Earth Battalion, also a co-religionist of Michael Aquino, but Timothy Challums instead is one of the chief instructors at SAM, the School of Advanced Military Studies in Kansas, where they incepted the H1N1. Now, in Kansas, where they created the plague that killed 100 million people, they have the School of Advanced Military Studies. That's where they train your Army officers. They don't just train them, they indoctrinate them. So they created what was called the Elite Corps of Jedi Knights, or Army officers who were indoctrinated into the Satanic Regiment. And in terms of the Satanic Army officers, they were indoctrinated by the likes of Colonel Timothy Challums, who stated in public, for everyone to hear, and quoted, and online, he stated that the true threat is not Islam, but Christianity. And he said that all these religions are based on irrationality, faith is irrational, and that we must get rid of faith and become the faithless. This is what he was indoctrinating the officers in who led your men into combat in Operation Desert Storm. And this class of the godless, as they called themselves, the so-called Jedi Knights of the United States Army, were the men who led the charge into Al-Kuwaiti and into southerly Al-Iraq. These were the men that incited Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden, of course, was a Saudi citizen. You think he was angered by all of these so-called crusaders who were brought in by the request of the king of the House of Saud? He was far more incited with the fact that they were satanic, that they were conducting satanic rituals on the site of the holiest sites of Islam, Al-Makkah and Al-Medina. And as a result, Osama bin Laden radicalized and turned from a CIA agent who was fighting on behalf of the Americans and the Arabs and Islam in Afghanistan to an enemy of the great Satan, the United States. And as a result, that led to his participation, however peripheral, in the Twin Towers, which of course was an inside job, but nevertheless had Saudi participation. So we have all of these chain reactions started because of your literally satanic military. And if at this point in life you think that your military is doing you any good at all other than bringing you terrorism, grief, suffering, and pain, you've got to wake up and get over it. And anyone who thinks they can do anything. A good example would be President Richard Milhous Nixon. Richard Milhous Nixon was raised under the fantasy that the Americans had won the Second World War through bombing, strategic bombing, atomic bombing, that this is what brought the Third Reich and Imperial Japan to their knees and put us on top of the world, which is why we had to have a strategic air command. So when Dien Bien Phu was under siege in Vietnam during the first Indo-Chinook conflict of the French against the Viet Minh, and Ho Chi Minh's forces had surrounded Dien Bien Phu, the French citadel of the Legion, and the rest of the regular forces, this was around March 20th of 1954. The French begged the Americans to deploy atomic ordnance in a triangulation pattern to lift the siege at Dien Bien Phu, to break the siege lines of the enemy. So Nixon said, we can do that. Let's organize what they later on operated as under the code name of as Operation Vulture. So he called together the Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and of course, he was Vice President, Eisenhower himself. They brought in the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Arthur Radford, if I remember. They all approached Eisenhower and said, we can do it. Let's launch Operation Vulture. We've got 2 aircraft carriers that had entered the Gulf of Tonkin. We've got B-29s that are ready at Clark Field in the Philippines. We've got elements of the 3rd Marine Division placed on alert. We've got 100 aircraft involved, and they've captured 5 U.S. servicemen already. They were captured by the Viet Minh at Dien Bien Phu. They are the first United States prisoners of war in the Vietnam War. We've got an excuse to go in and atomic bomb them with a triangulation of ordnance that'll break that siege. And Eisenhower looked at them all like they were crazy, and he said, you know, I was Supreme Commander Europe during the Second World War. I know all about the atomic bombing as conducted under Truman. It had nothing to do with the end of the war. The Japs was the term he used, of course, being the generation he was part of. He said they had us by the balls, and they could have exterminated all of the American population statistically, leaving only a few survivors plucking at roots if they had launched a biocidal. We sued for peace. They won. We lost. Get over it. And the atomic bombs were worthless. They had no military value, no impact. Well, all these men were shattered, of course, because none of them had the security clearances he had, his experience with military command, multinational command at that. He was in charge of coordinating the British, the French, even the Polish exile forces against the Germans. He had a far greater context in which to strategically recognize the lack of impact of atomic ordnance. So Nixon, later on, was so angry at the Strategic Air Command because at that point, he knew what they had done to Kennedy. He knew they had lied about the atomic bomb. So he approached the Strategic Air Command. He said, you motherfuckers, I want to win this war in Vietnam. You told me you could win a war by bombing. You show me you can win an effing war by bombing. I want you to bomb the North Vietnamese into submission. And it was December 19th of 1972. And he said, we've got 11 days to win this war because Christmas is coming up. So they organized Operation Linebacker 2. And what they wanted to do was win the war before Congress reconvened after January 1st of 1973. And he was going to be so kind to these spoiled, pampered darlings, this band of air pirates that we call the Strategic Air Command and the Air Force. He was so kind, he was going to give them 36 hours off over Christmas to suspend the bombing so they could all go home and visit their families. That's how spoiled these mofos are. And the Strategic Air Commander-in-Chief, General John C. Mayer, he basically said, well, the only U.S. planes capable of all-weather bombing would be, of course, their super expensive Air Force B-52s. And they didn't have enough General Dynamic F-11s, 111s, the Navy Grumman's, the 86 Intruders. They all basically had worn out all their supplies due to combat losses over Vietnam, so they had to rely on the super bombers, the strato bombers. So they called them up, and they basically began bombing. And on the night of the 12th through the 18th of 1972, that last month of December, the B-52s took off from Andersen Air Force Base, Guam, Utapao Air Base in Thailand, and on the first night, they lost 3 B-52s to Vietnamese surface-to-air missiles. Now, each one of those B-52s is a multi-billion-dollar plane. And December 21st, they lost 6 B-52s. They were down right over Hanoi, and the Vietnamese proclaimed to the world that this was the Dien Bien Phu of the air. And with all this 6% B-52 loss ratio, it became totally unsustainable. They had basically had only a small number available. They refused to communicate with the 7th Air Force, which was in country in Vietnam. And by the end of the operation, Linebacker 2, they had lost 15 B-52s and 9 other aircraft. Now, by the way, 15 B-52s, you know what that's equated to? That's the entire 509th Bomber Wing. That's the entire 509th Bomber Air Command. That's like the entire 509th Bomber Air Command that was stationed at Roswell Army Airfield was lost. The equivalent numbers over the sky battle. They just lost it all. At each one of those places, that was your entire budget. You lost the equivalent of like a year's worth of fiscal discretionary income over the skies of Hanoi during Christmas, and they lost the war. And that's when every American should have realized these guys are shit. Their combat capabilities are beneath contempt. They are worthless. They can't defend the country. They can't do anything. And it's about time you realize that now. You've got to get rid of your military. And basically the only defense that's going to protect you and your wife, your children, your family is your militia that you organize. And until you come to grips with that, you are forever going to remain under occupation by a military force that considers you the enemy, a junta. You are under occupation by a junta, which for all intents and purposes is foreign. So they're not serving your interests. They're serving that of an industry which is bringing in hordes of illegal immigrants and has been doing so ever since the Railroad Revolution. And you are still on wartime. Daylight savings time was originated in World War I, was immediately taken away, discontinued after World War I, and reestablished as wartime. You can look this up by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You are still on wartime. You are still on daylight savings time because we are still at war. So until you recognize that, and because it's war, for all intents and purposes, they consider you as an enemy in that war, then they can take you out at any time too. So give up any thought of normalcy in the world that you live in and wake up and smell the coffee. This is what makes me the most dangerous of all informants. Take a look at anything that they've been telling you in terms of Assange, Chelsea Manning, Snowden. Have they told you anything I'm saying? No. And for that reason, I'm one of the most dangerous men alive. And for that reason, things happen like my next door neighbor, Ryan Kelly Chamberlain II, poor son of a bitch, lived in this neighborhood for years. They raided his house. People can look this up. They can vet this. While I was in Las Vegas for the Super Soldier Summit, delivering my presentation on super soldierity, the phenomena thereof, peripherally what I've been explaining to you throughout the evening. And while I was delivering that in Las Vegas, then what happened was that the United States government said that there was a man next door to me, Ryan Kelly Chamberlain II. I had known him for years, only peripherally, never spoken to him, just knew him by sight. They claimed that he was manufacturing weapons of mass destruction. And they shut down Russian Hill. Everybody thought they were making a movie. They shut down Russian Hill, where I live. They brought in snipers, positioned them on the roof. They brought in the NEST squad, the Nuclear Emergency Search Team, claiming he had radiological materials, making a dirty bomb. They brought in the hazmat teams in moon suits. They brought in biohazard because they said he was manufacturing ricin. In the end, of course, they put out a national all-points bulletin on this guy that he was a wanted figure all over the United States. He was America's most wanted, the number one most wanted. He had no idea any of this was going down. He was in a bar, the Mad Dog in the Fog bar in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, drinking, when some think turned him in and got their Judas reward. And he later on drove to the bottom of the Golden Gate Bridge where he was looking at the ocean, and that's where they took him down. He had no idea any of this was going on. And they locked him away in jail without any access to media, and you will never hear from him again. But next door was totally emptied out. They took everything out of it and set up every single bit of surveillance equipment you could imagine. They scraped through the walls, took down half the walls so they could put up surveillance equipment right next door, beaming on me 24 hours a day. That's how serious what I'm saying is. And anyone who doubts me can look up this poor bastard and what happened to him. And, of course, the fact you'll never hear from him again. And his greatest crime was to be living next door to me. And you know what they finally got him on? Rosary peas. Rosary peas. They said he had rosary peas in the house. And if he ground them down using industrial processing methods, he could conceivably kill a few hundred people if he could just distribute enough powder in everybody's dish. Rosary peas. That's what they got him on. Seriously, I'm not kidding. That's all they were able to come up with. So this is the world we live in. Now take a look at what happened to me in Las Vegas. Then while I'm in Las Vegas, there was, of course, Jared and his wife Mandy, the Millers. And the Millers were in Las Vegas because we had the Super Soldier Summit on mind control. And they felt that they were under terrible mental assault, terrible mind control. And, of course, they were working with Vanderbeek, who's running for the governorcy of the state of Nevada. And, of course, Sheriff Gonzalez, I believe his name is. I might be wrong on that, but I believe that's his name. But whoever's running for sheriff alongside in a campaign team with Vanderbeek, who's running for the governorcy of the state of Nevada, the Millers had been up at the Bundy Ranch in Nevada. So they had sold everything they had, went up to the Bundy Ranch, were conducting interviews, and they got kicked off the Bundy Ranch. They volunteered for the campaign to get the Vanderbeek into office. They were certain they were mind controlled. They definitely wanted to know how to break out of such mind control, and in the end, alluded to being sent to kill Vanderbeek and and Sheriff Gonzalez, or both of these men who want those offices, and broke out of the programming and killed 2 cops instead. And then went to the local Walmart, was it? I think it was, and basically told everybody to leave. And the only other person they killed was a man with a concealed carry license who approached them with intent to kill them. And then they shot him, and then they killed each other. So their original intent had been to massacre everyone at the Super Soldier Mind Control Summit, where I was presenting. Now, look at what I'm presenting you, and everybody can look this up, that everything happened at exactly the times I'm describing. And you'll realize, look, you're dealing with the real deal here. This is the whistleblower. This is the most dangerous man alive. So all these clowns out there who keep clowning me on YouTube and the internet and all the rest of that, you can all go eat shit. Because the reality is right in front of you. It's reported in the news every day. And none of this was happening around Assange. None of this was happening around Snowden or Chelsea Manning. So get it together, folks, and realize that you got to start taking what I'm saying seriously. Because I don't know how much longer I'm going to be around. But the more I talk, the more public what I say is made known, the more guarantee I have of staying alive. So,
and you bring up a very interesting point with all the information that you're bringing out and the attempts to defame your character, the Patsy attempt back in the 90s, the trip to Australia. I mean, it's obviously got to be quite overwhelming, and then your next door neighbor gets basically taken out to where now he is in who knows where and for how long. How do you deal with everyday life, man? I mean, what's a typical day like for you, Douglas?
Well, my life is anything but normal, as you can imagine. And the stress that I was dealing with in the last 11 years before my mother died in 2011, under highly suspect circumstances, it's pretty obvious she was murdered. But the point is that, in a very real sense, that freed me to do what I'm doing now. But my responsibilities with my parents were far more stressful than anything in combat. I've been shot at, I've been stabbed, I was exposed to cyclosorine nerve gas in the Gulf War when they blew the bunker numbers 2 through 7 in Kamasaya, and that was blown by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The cyclosorine nerve gas had been used against the Kurds in Iraq, And when that was blown, it, of course, flew right towards us, the frontline Marines, who had just marched all the way through the tank traps and tank mines, fields of tank mines, anti-tank mines in Al-Kuwait. And by the time Task Force Taro reached the other end of Kuwait, we faced this Technicolor mushroom cloud that was these bunkers being blown in southerly Al-Iraq by the Corps of Engineers, and all of us inhaled our share of lethal nerve gas. Now, the majority of other men who were under VA care, of course, ultimately died. Now, I was dishonorably discharged, so I had no access to VA care, which is why I'm alive. Basically, I wound up going to UCSF, and they were able to conduct some very radical experimental surgery. They basically unhinged my lower jawbone and opened my mouth extremely wide, shoved in a bunch of instruments, and stapled my lungs to my rib cage. And I'm at 30% lung capacity, but I'm still alive, as opposed to all of these other GIs, even the ones that are alive. Many Marines can barely talk, honestly. So, comparatively speaking, I got off light in that regard. None of that was as stressful. Nothing I did in mercenary work or security work, none of that was as stressful as taking care of my parents. Every day we were dealing with a life or death situation with them. Their health was so impacted by misadministration of prescription drugs, missed diagnoses, malpractice, and yet I was able to keep them alive for over a decade. My father died in 2007, my mother in 2011, and by that time, I was learning to deal with stress on a daily basis. Every single birthday, every single marriage anniversary, every single holiday, we spent in the emergency room, not in the hospital, the emergency room where they had to be on life support. So every single day off or a Sunday, I would have to call the ambulance. The fire department and the ambulance knew me quite well. So I developed, if you will, a kind of working relationship with them as much as one can work with such establishments like that, which have their own corruption and incompetence. But at any rate, kept my parents alive through that. It was hell on earth. It was a subhuman existence. It was literally going for days without sleeping, eating, or bathing. And as a matter of fact, like any veteran in a constant combat situation, realistically throughout that decade, I never really truly was able to bathe except rarely, because anytime you get into the tub or the shower naked is when some emergency would happen, or it would be similar to experiencing an attack if you're in the field. And so this is why so many veterans stink and why they become homeless and they never bathe. You become afraid to take off your clothes and enter a shower or a bathtub. You cannot relax. So it was like that all the while. My parents were alive and spiraling and degenerating in health, with a lot of help from the Veterans Administration on the part of my dad and the medical industrial complex in general on the part of my mom. So compared to that, this is nothing. Now that they're both passed, this kind of stress that I deal with in terms of threats to life, for instance, my phone is always unplugged. Basically, I can only leave the answering service on and take messages. But the reality is, if I plug it in, like I have to do sometimes when I'm waiting for a call from Coast to Coast AM or something else, somebody says they're going to call me at a certain time, as soon as I plug it in, nonstop phone calls, and there's nobody at the other end of the line. And it's been that way for a good deal of my life. That's, yeah, I mean, literally, no matter what, as soon as I plug that phone in, it'll ring. So that's and there's no one at the other end. And sometimes you'll hear them. You'd think it was automated. You'd think, well, it must be automated. But it's not. And sometimes you'll hear them drop the line, like some bungler will drop the line. So there's somebody who's literally alive at the other end of the line who's got nothing else to do in their lives other than call me. And so that's the kind of life you live as a whistleblower. It's literally nothing you would ever want to drag anyone else into. This is why all of my sexual relationships are paid relationships. I pay for paid escorts. And I'm very open about this. And the reason I have to be is because if I did not, that is something that they would try to take down my reputation with. If I'm upfront about the fact that I use legal prostitutes and escorts, that all of them are of legal age, then this puts it out there so that I can never be discredited by them claiming that I'm using some underage or illegal prostitute, etc. So that's one of the things I have to bring out. This is what life is like as a whistleblower. So anyone who thinks of this as anything where I'm making money or that this is something where I'm seeking fame, you're out of your fucking head. Because there is nothing in this that is worth that kind of lifestyle. You can't have children. You can't develop a relationship with somebody on any normal level. So your life is constantly under siege, and you cannot, for instance, when I was in Australia, one of the things I had, because you're guilty until proven innocent, I could not enter an elevator with any unescorted female or child. Because the moment you do, by the time you reach another floor, they could scream rape. And you are guilty till proven innocent. So a place like Australia, think about what I'm saying, or any Commonwealth nation, someone like me can't do anything. Look at Assange. Where was he when they accused him of rape? He was in England. You're guilty till proven innocent. And guess what? They proved him innocent because he had sex with two females at once. There's no way he could have raped them both at once. It was logically concluded without one of them calling for help or running to get help. So what did they get him on? Do you remember what they got him on? He didn't use a condom. He didn't use a condom, so he was arrested for having unsafe sex. That's what they got him for. He's spending the rest of his life in the functional equivalent of jail in the Ecuadorian embassy for having unsafe sex.
Well, if they want you, clearly they can either, come up with something retarded or, plant evidence on you, come up with some excuse. They control the majority of the media. So people, the majority of people are like sheep. It's very unfortunate. You bring something out, you package it well, you can convince the majority of people on just about anything. And when you live in a society that the controllers call people that want to bring out the truth and help people, they call them terrorists, when the real terrorists are called, the aristocratic lifesavers, and they're getting awards like the Peace Nobel Prize and stuff like that. Sometimes it's absurd, man. It's absurd. You see cell phone towers next to schools. They put extra fluoride in certain waters for children to supposedly help their teeth. They put thimerosal in vaccines that are injected directly into the bloodstream. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize the people that control the world really don't like us very much.
Yeah, it's very true, but take heart in, despite everything that I'm telling you that is depressing, think of the positive, which is in the reality they are so corrupt, they are so incompetent, they are so morbidly inbred, they're so retarded, that they're really incapable of carrying out anything at an organized level, and that is why I can get away with what I get away with. I've accumulated enough collateral to use, of course, against them to maintain a balance of power or a balance of terror in my own life. Those that don't wind up like the Assanges or like the Snowdens, and despite all of the positives of Snowden's lifestyle, like you said, and believe me, I know what you say is true, Snowden's got all of these Russian chicks around him. He's a prisoner, but they try to keep him a happy prisoner because they do want him to voluntarily, to what extent we could use the term voluntarily, they do want him to at least appear on videos and speak against the United States government in such a manner that the Russian people can look across the Atlantic or across the Pacific, because they border the United States more on the Pacific than they do in the Atlantic. And the Russian people can look across the Pacific and say, gosh, these Americans are really fucked. And that way Putin maintains a better spin on the people who live in Russia, that they should stay in Russia. And, of course, so he's a kind of tool in that sense. He's a tool against other governments. So, yeah, he's a prisoner, but they'll do their best to make certain that he's not suffering as a prisoner. And what does that tell you? That puts the Russians just leagues ahead of America, where if Assange ever got basically shipped back to the States, they'd put him in Gitmo, torture him to the point of insanity, and you'd never hear of him again. So, I mean, which side is the true evil in this new game of nations? Well, when you hear about everything I've exposed from World War I to World War II, etc., basically you realize that of all the totalitarian governments, certainly the United States is the worst in terms of what it's done. Now, all of this I present to you, and I have to say, think of yourself as an American. There were Soviet citizens during the time of the constitutional republic known as the Soviet Union. Soviet is simply the Russian word for collective. That's when they collectivized everyone. But 1,000 years before there was a Soviet Union, there were Russians. And there are Russians now that the Soviet Union has collapsed. The Soviet Union is done and gone, but the Russians are still there, albeit teetering on the brink of extinction because of their own problems with the genocide, auto-genocide, or self-extermination that took place under the communist regime over multiple generations, but particularly under Stalin. But they lost so many people to him, and afterwards to drinking problems, drug problems. I'm not exaggerating. These are major phenomena in the cause of their decline in population. Cheap, safe, legal, state-sponsored abortion, and that has nothing to do with a judgment in terms of any theological sense, just in terms of the fact that it's there. The numbers have been whittled down because it's available, because no one can afford to have children. Because they can't afford to have children, the average Russian woman has experienced between 4 to 6 abortions in her lifetime. So, because who would want to bring a child into a environment where you can't feed them? You can't afford to feed them. So that's the tragedy of the Russian population. But nevertheless, the Russians have survived the Soviet Republic. Now, the Americans were here as European Americans. Obviously, we have the indigenous populations here for well over 1,000 years, 2,000 or more. And they've been here for millennia. But beyond that, the European Americans started arriving about 600 years ago, over 500 years ago. They arrived, of course, with the failed colonies of Croatoa, Roanoke, and, of course, continued to arrive Plymouth Rock with the Pilgrims and the Puritans. And what they had was a theocracy. And it was only around 1776, 77, actually, that a constitutional republic was established. And what was it? Basically a Freemasonic occupation government. And this fog, if you will, of Freemasons considered themselves a nobility, an elite, quite separate from the peasantry, the Americans. And so you have to start thinking of yourself as an American and not as a U.S. citizen. Your U.S. citizenship is a bane. It is a burden imposed on you, and not in any noble sense. It is a bane imposed on you like a mark of the devil. And so you really have to start thinking of yourself, I am not a U.S. citizen. I am an American, and when the constitutional republic of the United States collapses, I will still be here. And America and Americans will still be here. That is the attitude that Americans need to begin to cultivate so we can proceed with Reconstruction when this monstrosity collapses in upon itself, based on its own contradictions and its own corruption. I hope that sounds coherent.
Well, let me jump in here for a minute, too, because at the beginning of this show, we were discussing, the Clintons and the Bush family, or you could say the Bush dynasty, and now you've got Obama in power, which seemed to come kind of out of the blue. There's a lot of speculation who he was, what he is. There's tons of chatter on the Internet. But really, like you said, you brought up a good point. Whoever put him in power is obviously above the Bush family and the Clinton family, if what you say of them, having everything lined up to be in power is accurate. And it makes me wonder, okay, why? Why now? Is it because the economy is almost ready to collapse and the orchestrators knew that, so they put him in at a specific time? You've got basically the southern border completely opened up now. You've got so many people falling apart at the seams, and it makes me wonder if this is all completely orchestrated and they're getting ready to pull the curtains and the bomb is going to drop. Do you think that pretty soon, with all these hollow point bullets that are being stockpiled by DHS and everything else that's in play, that we could very well be leading into a World War III or a civil war within the United States?
Well, it's always important to maintain that set of suspicion, that kind of precautionary attitude. Fear is your best friend in many ways. Fear will keep you alive. You cannot, of course, trust the government. That's one of the reasons why Stephen King, the horror fiction author, was so popular, and so many men like him are so popular, is because it's so obvious that they do not trust the system. What is the one thing that constantly shines through popular novels is a distrust of the government, and rightly so. But the point is that the reality that I've exposed to you is that when you've got a military that's less than 1% of the population, and keep in mind that overwhelming majority of that has never seen combat, they're in logistical support, they're quartermasters, they're operating warehouses, they're cooking, they're, in the medical field, etc. Very few people in the military are even involved with combat. Those that supposedly are, very few of them ever see combat. So those that do are used up literally to death. They redeploy them and redeploy them again and again and again until they go mad or die, and often both. So with a situation like that, you develop highly unstable, burned out killers. They are not very good for organized combat. You have a case that's more or less the equivalent of, and by the time they're through with them, they're literally useless for organized warfare. So the rest of them, of course, aren't useful for warfare at all. So say they brought every single soldier home from overseas and said, we've got all these hollow point bullets. You don't have enough. Okay, you only have 2 arms. I mean, how many of these guys you going to give these guns to use all these bullets on people? And do you get everybody to line up? Oh, well, the FEMA camps. Yeah, trust me on this. How would they get you there? How would they round you up?
How about, sorry to interrupt, but how about they did that, the Boston Marathon supposed bombings from these, basically teenagers and guy that looks like he's 22, 23, these from European descent. They've got crisis actors that look like smoke bombs. I don't think anybody truly lost their legs that day. I think it was all smoke and charades. But what did they do with that? Well, they caused full-on lockdown in Boston. Many of the suburbs, they went door to door, touting their armored tanks and their SWAT gear, their stormtroopers, going door to door, pulling people out of their houses. They made them leave for up to a week in some cases. And they had 4,000 or 5,000 police officers looking for these 2 dissidents, basically. I think, in my personal opinion, I feel that was a complete staged event to show not only, we're here for your protection, for the sheeple, but for the people that are aware and know what's going on, saying, look, this is what we're going to do. We have control. We can go door to door, and the majority of people are just going to lay down and comply.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, believe me, there is nothing that you have just articulated that I disagree with. Everything you say is absolutely valid. Let's put that into some perspective. First off, you remember what I said about the military, what little manpower they have, how incapable it really is of impacting the population as a whole, even if they were to bring every soldier back from overseas and basically turn on the martial law, actually declare it. There's no way they can enforce it. And then you bring up, of course, the militarization of local constabularies, or police departments, as well as fire brigades, so to speak, that they bring in from the FBI, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Again, all of this, first off, to reinforce what you're saying, when it came to the Boston Marathon bombing, exactly as you say, suddenly all of these armored cars and vehicles show up that say Boston PD. Now, you go to places in San Francisco and something similar would happen if there was a bombing in San Francisco. Suddenly, all these armored vehicles would show up, very similar to what you saw in Boston, if not identical. They would all say SSPD. Now, all of these vehicles are operated by fire brigades because anyone who drives around constantly as many of us have to, in these major urban areas, we pass by police stations all the time. We look at the parking lot, and we see nothing there but regular patrol cars. And you say, well, they've got special garages, et cetera. Oh, I'm sure they do. And there are SWAT team facilities, and they've got some pretty heavily bunkered areas, comparatively speaking. But the reality is, how is it that these armored vehicles, these massive buses to hold hundreds of prisoners, where do they come from? I mean, really, these, incidents occur, and suddenly all of these come out of everywhere, but nobody's seen them in the years that they've been going into the local municipal district's government building. So, you don't see them anywhere. Where do they come from? Do they keep them in, suburban areas outside of city limits? It doesn't make any sense. So basically, one of the conclusions one has to draw is that your local constabularies are instantly buffered in these prepared events by basically federal fire brigades, which are undercover as local constabularies. But look at what I'm saying, prepared events. If you don't have a prepared event with the Boston bombing, where obviously they're prepared for it, obviously it was a setup, based on everything that you say, yes, I believe people died at the Boston bombing because they don't give a shit. They have no cares about killing people, and I hope you wouldn't disagree with that. So some people died, but there were indeed actors who had already suffered amputation in the past who were being passed off as having lost their legs on the scene. Now that's obvious because they had all this blood on their stumpy legs. They should have been hemorrhaging and bleeding out almost instantly.
Right.
But no, they're holding their legs up and there's no blood coming out. It's just their legs looking all juicy and red, but there's no blood hemorrhaging out. So I don't care that they could give a person enough painkillers to the point where he could watch himself hemorrhage to death and look at it with fairly equivocally. I mean, basically, he'd be so doped out of his mind, he could look at that and feel very peaceful about it. I mean, yeah, he could do that, but they couldn't stop the bleeding. There's no tourniquet in the world that could stop something like that with somebody who's lost their leg at that level of high up near the pelvis, for instance. So that was
right.
Obviously actors who had lost limbs in earlier accidents or in the Vietnam conflict or even now Iraq or something like that.
Right.
So these were pre-planned, and that's obvious how they were able to bring all these armored vehicles and super buses to bear and all the rest of this shit is because it was pre-planned. Now, in the event of any real riot, in the event of any real shakedown, civil collapse, civil disturbance, they don't have the ability to transport that there. These fire brigades are not teleporting. They cannot bring them, and anybody who goes into the underground railways or subways, it's not to deny that they haven't been working on such things. It doesn't matter. They don't have the manpower. They don't have the manpower. All the police in any major city, take a look at your population of police to your baseline population in any major city where the overwhelming majority of America's population resides, and they're a fly speck on the population. There is no way they can control a real breakdown. And police know this. And the same goes for any town with the sheriff. The same goes for the rest of the United States. They can put together all the FBI, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Again, only a few of those personnel are trained in SWAT team type units. And you put all those SOGers or Special Operation Group types together, along with all the police all over major urban areas who are mostly fat and mostly out of weight. Do you remember the Columbine massacre or what was that other schoolyard massacre? All the police showed up, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I'm trying to remember. I don't know. It was well after Columbine. There was the Virginia Tech.
Virginia Tech, yes. Virginia Tech.
Virginia Tech. If anyone is able to get uncensored footage from Virginia Tech where some Asian guy went ballistic and killed a bunch of people, basically you had a situation where all these cops showed up, all these local sheriffs, and when I looked at it, I was laughing my ass off because all these mofos could barely walk. They were so fat that they were putting on their Kevlar vests, and it looked like they were wearing baby bibs. I swear to God, their Kevlar vests only covered the torso space between their nipples and shit. And I said, this has got to be a joke, man. These guys haven't exercised in 20, and none of them could fit through the windows to go in to get anybody. That's why they had to call SWAT. So all they could do is just surround the place and huff and puff until SWAT showed up. And it's a joke. The majority of your policemen are just unable to enforce the law physically, let alone obey orders from some SWAT team that starts deputizing them or delegating authority, which is what they would have to do. So, look, the whole concept of they're going to round you up and take you to a FEMA camp, get over it. So you got to ask yourself, okay, what are the FEMA camps for? The FEMA camps are for government workers. Because when the United States dollar collapses and they're no longer able to buy them off in money, they basically just take all of their families, they round them up and put them into these FEMA camps and say, you keep working or we kill them. That's what the FEMA camps are for. They're not for you. They're for government workers. Because government workers are working in places where they know where to round them up. Good neighborhoods. Government workers invariably live in good neighborhoods because as a government worker, you can never be fired. You have medical insurance up the ass. You've got retirement benefits. You've got paid for, on tax dollars, paid for child care, paid for support. You remember the Oklahoma City bombing? One of the things that Timothy McVeigh said was, I regret the fact that I killed some children at Oklahoma City bombing. But he also pointed out, quite realistically, that those kids wouldn't have been there if all these government workers didn't get free daycare on your tax dollar. You have to pay for babysitters or to dump your kids off at daycare while you work yourself to death, and the majority of your income goes towards that. The government workers don't spend any of that. They bring their kids for free and dump them off at these government daycare centers right there in the federal building. They visit them at lunchtime. It's like bringing your kids to work, but you've got babysitters there for them. So imagine that kind of lifestyle, dude. I mean, these guys are so privileged. They do not live like you or I at all, and you can never, ever be fired. I've emphasized that before. So these people are the ultimate consummate parasites, but guess what? The government knows exactly where each one lives. They make so much money, they're spending none of it on insurance, none of it on retirement, none of it on daycare. So they've got money up the ass. So they all live in good neighborhoods, and the government knows exactly where they all live. There are prices to be paid for that kind of lifestyle. One is that when the shit hits the fan, the U.S. dollar collapses, nobody believes it anymore, they realize it's toilet paper, then at that point the government comes in with a gun, all those families are rounded up, they're stuck in the FEMA camp, and you're working for food. That's the price they pay for the security and the privilege they've led up until now. That's who the FEMA camps are for. You don't have to worry about it. They don't have the manpower to round you up for that. So in terms of when the shit hits the fan, you're a free man. Your family is free. There's nothing they can do to you. They're too busy covering their own ass. They're buying all those hollow point bullets. Of course they're preparing for an apocalypse. But are they going to use it to blow you away? How could they do that? You'd have to stand in line and stand still by the hundreds of thousands for them to have an effect on you. No one's going to do that. If you think that, then your faith in the body politic is even less than mine.
Let me jump in here for just 1 second, Douglas. We're done here on Blog Talk, but we're going to continue the streams at disclosuremedia.net. Ladies and gentlemen, go to disclosuremedia.net. We'll finish the show up there. I'd also like to thank the Channy Project, thechannyproject.com. That is an excellent forum for alternative news and information. Also check out Douglas Dietrich, douglasdietrich.com. Is that your website, Douglas?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. And
fantastic.
People go there. MindControlSummit.com. Go over there and we'll be set. I think we're off Blog Talk now. Right. Oh, by the way, I would like to tell everyone, use the code word John23, capital J, OHN is all lowercase, then the number 23, numeric 23, the year in which my mother was born, 1923. And with John 23, you can use the code word to access mindcontrolsummit.com and take a look at our last Mind Control Summit from last year, in which I'm one of the presenters, and you can access 14 hours of audio video and do that for about $20 using that code word only through this program, the Disclosure Media Network program. So please do that, and that'll help to support my mistress and manageress who was just presenting in Las Vegas. Lori Ann Fenton, and she's the executrix of my will, my Marine Corps life insurance if something happens to me, which was still maintained after my dishonorable discharge and that's legal, by the way. But at any rate, she had to vacate a fire that was set while she was presenting in Las Vegas at her latest conference. Think of the lives we're leading. And she evacuated along with many other people in a crowd, and she broke her shoulder. So her shoulder is broken now, and we risked our lives by bringing you this information. So honestly, people, those that are out there clowning us all the time and saying that this is something that we're making money off of, you know, you can go literally fuck yourself. I mean, I have to say
this is definitely for mature audiences, folks.
Yeah.
Well, and I appreciate what you're saying too, because a lot of people think that because you're trying to sell a DVD with excellent information in it, that you're just out for the money. Yet people do have to survive. You have to make a living, and when you're full time exposing these megalomaniacs, and your life is being threatened constantly or just attacked in some way to survive and just make a little bit of money for your work, I don't see what's wrong with that. When people say money is the root of all evil, how is that the root of all evil? If you need money to survive and you want to lead a decent life, I would say greed is more so a root of evil than money.
Of course. I mean, obviously that goes without saying, and obviously the money that you and I are making are hardly, we couldn't call it making money. We're treading water. So
exactly.
We're basically just trying to survive. Do keep that in mind, people. And I do think that many people understand that. Unfortunately, the biggest problem we have with many Americans is they want to look cool, they want to look streetwise, so they dismiss everything anyone says, and they'll try and look savvy. But in reality, they're just pridefully ignorant. And that's the horror of the situation. The greatest defense that the powers that be have is your desire to maintain some kind of facade as your average tax-paying American, that you know something, that, oh, this guy's scamming or this guy's not telling the truth. Of course you have to use discretionary judgment. But how much more do I need to bring up before you realize, God, this guy's really paying a price. The people around him are paying a price. I better take what he's saying seriously before I start paying a price.
Well, you know, Douglas, I've interviewed a lot of people, and when you interview people, you can tell when they are a lot of times exaggerating or adding extras to their story or to their testimony. And, people can discern that and pick it out for themselves. I'm sure that most people that listen to you, even if it's information that is completely opposite of what they've been told and taught their whole lives, it's certainly going to make them question it and do more research for themselves. And I like how you say, don't take your word for it. Don't take anybody's word for it. Do the research yourself, look it up, and if you feel that information is accurate, then hey, go with it. Do what you think's right. If we could, Douglas, and I don't know how much more time you could spend with us, but a lot of our listeners have jumped over to these other streams, and we've got a few questions about some of the stuff with the military, the House of Set, Michael Aquino. Would it be okay if I asked you a couple questions about that?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, with the House of Set, it looks like a lot of their principles and ideals have been modeled and based upon not only the Church of Satan, but Aleister Crowley, a lot of his work that he put together. A lot of the stuff, though, seems to go back into ancient Egypt times. So what are the connections there? I mean, are these rituals that they're using now within the military and stuff to bring in these deities that they can control? Are they doing the same rituals that they did 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago?
No, that's an interesting point, and I would argue that no. I would argue no, because what has happened was with the advent of one of the world's first truly global empires in recorded history. There may have been world-spanning empires in the past. Civilizations have risen and fallen over millennia, and they may have been lost in prehistoric times, literally pre-recorded times, to use a pun. But in terms of recorded history, the world's first truly global empire was the British Empire. And the British Empire is when things began to radically change. things began to radically warp and pervert, and the entire game of sacrifice was ratcheted up to entirely new levels. So what we experienced during the time of the British Empire was their occupation of the Raj, of British India, and at that period in history, the British had basically taken over the lives of over 1 billion people. So if you took into account the subcontinent of India and added on all of the land they occupied in Africa, Australia, etc., they ruled essentially a full quarter, 25%, a quarter of the world's land surface and much of the world's oceans. They pretty much dominated the sea channels. And this happened in an incredibly short period of time. I mean, they experienced a rise in empire and a subsequent collapse, which, if you count some very long-lived individuals, survivors of Elizabethan times, into Victorian times, into basically, of course, Churchillian times, for lack of a better word, you had some people who were able to see the rise and plateau of the zenith of the British Empire, and other people who were at the zenith, and they were able to witness the plateau and fall of the British Empire. So literally, about 2 to 3 generations, you had a meteoric rise and fall of global proportions, and it doesn't really logically make any sense, because at the time that the British Empire really faced its greatest life or death challenge, which was the time of their war with Spain and prior to the invasion of the Spanish Armada. Britain was an island that had about as many people on it as the island on which I was born, which is the island of Taiwan. Now, the Nationalist Republic of China, which resettled on the island of Taiwan, of course, the population at this point in history, about 25 million people. Now, the nation of Britain had a number that was a bit smaller than that during the times of the beginnings of its rise, about 20 million people. Later exploded in population with the Industrial Revolution and exploded in terms of its power. Now, a lot of this happened when they began experimenting with the occult. And, of course, one of the primary men who was very famous for working with the occult was John Dee. And John Dee had, of course, his Irish companion, Mr. Kelly, and the two of them made a living by basically going around continental Europe and ripping off the crowns of Europe through various fortune-telling scams, etc. But they were doing this in the name of British intelligence and reconnaissance. And it was through such wiles and some actual remote viewing, before it was given the title of remote viewing, using the scrying of the crystal ball of Edward Kelly, they were able to ultimately discern various espionages going on in Britain against the British people. They were able to identify a conspiracy to burn down Britain's forests, which would have deprived it of lumber to build its ships to stand against the Spanish Armada. So they were responsible for that on public record. They were also, and officially recognized as such, they were also officially recognized because John Dee was recognized as the sorcerer of the crown, officially recognized and sponsored sorcerer in the same sense that Colonel Michael Aquino was the officially recognized satanic chaplain of the U.S. Army. Only John Dee was not satanic. But what he is credited for is raising Britain's version of the kamikaze, or the divine wind, which was the original concept that later on had its name transferred to the Suicide Corps, which did so much damage and played such a pivotal role in the Second World War. Despite whatever propaganda your American Office of War Information has conspired to feed to you and indoctrinate yourself with, the kamikaze were a decisive factor in how that war turned out towards Japanese favor. Well, they were inspired by original divine storm that wiped out the Mongol fleet invading Japan. So when the Spanish Armada was headed towards England, John Dee is credited officially on record at that period in time with raising the storm that helped to scatter and sink the Spanish Armada, which the rest of the British ships that were built because they prevented the forest from being burned down were able to hunt down and seek and destroy on a much more individual level. So John Dee was recognized as the original 007. That was his initials. He would sign off as 007. And that was what inspired the James Bond character. And imagine a combination of James Bond and Harry Potter, and you've got John Dee. Now, he and Edward Kelly both died pretty much miserable and penniless, which shows in the end that these were true patriots as opposed to people who were out to make a buck. Now, in terms of their legacy, the British Empire had been impressed with the workings of magic, with a K at the end, actual ritual magic, as opposed to the prestidigitation or legerdemain or stage magic. And they continued to follow it as an upper class. The upper class, of course, had consulted John Dee for horoscopes, various forms of divination. So they went further when they took over the Raj. When they conquered the South Asian continent or subcontinent of India, one of the first things that they established, being a nation of gardeners and very good at gardening in an environment that is otherwise very hostile to gardens, they were able to transfer some of that skill to their conquest of South Asia. Here's how they did it. The average English hedgerow can grow formidably thick in England itself. As a matter of fact, the French hedgerows on continental Europe played a decisive part in European combat after Normandy. Far more important in the career of General Irvin Rommel, the field marshal who was responsible for the feats of the Africa Corps, far more important was his being in charge or placed in charge of constructing the in-depth defenses of Normandy and France. And far more men died invading France and dealing with its in-depth defenses than died on the beaches of Normandy. So this all happened because of what the Americans called hedgerow hell, what the Germans and the French referred to as the bocage country. The bocage country, they had very thick, thorny hedgerows that they hollowed out, put in sniper's nests, mortar emplacements, machine gun nests. They bunkered them, and ultimately the only way the Americans could contend with them was by literally welding on forklifts to their tanks so they could ram right through the hedgerows and uproot them with the tank-driven forklifts. So this resulted, of course, in 400% the rounds of mental breakdowns and psychological trauma, as recorded by Army psychiatrists and psychologists, than occurred on the Normandy invasion itself. This resulted in far more expenditure of ammunition at enemies they could not see or reach. So you basically had a situation in which the hedgerow proved itself as a formidable defense. The British took it down to India, where in the tropical climate, the hedgerow mutated into mutathorn, which created a massive hedgerow in that environment, similar to the phenomenon of kudzu, a transplanted Japanese plant, which in the deep south resulted in a monstrous overgrowth that has managed to eat the majority of the southern states in terms of vegetation coverage. Well, the British brought down the English hedgerow, had it grow to monumental proportions, and they created what was known as the Great Hedge of India. And they grew it east to west, north to south, and they divided the subcontinent into 4 quarters. They crucified the entire subcontinent of India on a crown of thorns. And this Great Hedge of India is something anyone can look up. They can verify it existed. But it existed while the British were there to maintain it. They hollowed it out, put in guard points, and they were able to decide who lived, who died, who got rice in one area, who did not, who got medicines in one area, who did not. They were able to reward someone in one area who collaborated and able to starve someone to death who did not. So with this, they, over their rule of several generations, killed 100 million people. 100 million people out of 1 billion. Now that's an enormous. Think about what I said about the Americans and what they did in World War I. We're talking megadeath. Megadeath that has never existed before or occurred before in recorded history with the advent of the English-speaking empires. So the English-speaking empires are doing something that no other empires have ever done before. And they're messing with sacrifice on a massive scale. And anyone who doubts this need only look at the Trinity Site Project. Now, the Americans, of course, like every nation on Earth, once Albert Einstein came up with E equals mc squared, the equivalency of matter and energy, every physicist in the world knew that that could lead to a tremendous release in energy. So everyone began to write about atomic bombs in science fiction. They were writing about atomic bombs nuking cities until they glowed in the 1920s. So all of this, the general public was aware of in terms of the potential of atomic power. But the physicists also realized that with certain elements, such as plutonium, you could create a chain reaction that could literally continue its chain reaction, like an endless series of billiards or pool on a table in terms of molecules that would, as a fissile reaction, continue to expand until it consumed everything, literally everything in the world, and turn our world into a burning star. Now, in terms of the uranium bombs, the Axis had created them well before the Americans had deployed them as atomic ordnance. They knew them as line breakers. They made no big deal of them because they didn't view them as anything that was fit for strategic warfare. They used them on an operational level. They used them to disintegrate the Soviet advance on the Korean Peninsula. They used them to stop the Soviets in the nation of Estonia from advancing into the Courland pocket, where they were conducting the largest evacuation of civilian personnel in recorded history. So in terms of their use of atomic bombs, they were working with what they knew was safe. The Americans, on the other hand, started experimenting with plutonium. And at Trinity site, named after, of course, the Holy Trinity, inverted into an unholy Trinity, they conducted an alchemical experiment in the creation and destruction of primordial matter. But all of the physicists, from Enrico Fermi to Opperman to Teller, they all knew that the chance was there that this could continue in its chain reaction uncontrollably, unstoppably, and could destroy the Earth. And their military elite knew it as well. Who was the military elite? They were represented by the likes of Leslie Groves. And General Leslie Groves, of course, was the man responsible for the construction of the greatest occult artifact on the surface of our planet, the Pentagon. The Pentagon, of course, was based on human sacrifice. Who did they sacrifice? Thousands of African Americans who lived in the Hell's Bottom neighborhood. They moved them. They made them homeless. They told that entire community that if their husbands want to earn some money to keep feeding their families, they could join the military because we were going to start the biggest war that mankind had ever seen, and we needed the biggest office building in the world from which to manage it. And the day on which General Leslie Groves had the groundbreaking ceremony in which he turned the first spade of dirt under his foot to break open the construction of the Pentagon was September 11th. 1941, months before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
September 11th.
Yeah, and on September 11th of 1941, he said, we're going to need all the metal in the United States to build planes and trucks and tanks and bombs and ships and guns. So the entire Pentagon was constructed out of concrete. It was made not with any elevator cables made of steel. There are only ramps. And so anything that as an elevator or anything that involves steel was added much, much later, if at all. None was really added until shortly before September 11th of 2001, when they took the fifth wing of the Pentagon, the fifth side of the Pentagon, the side that was the most unholy, the southerly facing, and they replaced all of the concrete construction with steel reinforcements. And, of course, added sprinkler systems, which didn't exist anywhere else in the Pentagon because it was built out of concrete and nothing would ever burn. So all of this was added, and that's where we're told the plane hit on September 11th, 2001. That's the side that gets hit. Isn't that miraculous? The only side with bomb-proof windows. The only side with fire exits. Isn't that a coincidence? Oh my God. And all the people that are able to work on any given day the Pentagon holds 1,500 people. And out of this 1,500 people, that day, September 11th of 2001, nobody was there. There was a few hundred people there involved with accounting in that very wing, investigating and auditing where all that money they give every year goes in terms of where the Pentagon distributes it. And of course, all those died at the Pentagon, including one child 7 years old and one senior visiting a relative of his who's 71 years old. So that is your government. What were they? A satanic sacrifice. It was built on sacrifice. It will end in sacrifice. And in terms of that Pentagon itself, those people who represented that Pentagon went to New Mexico, set up Trinity Site, and they blew the plutonium bomb that they thought would destroy the Earth. Why? Because they knew they were losing the war. Everything they tell you otherwise is a sham. They were losing the war in every possible way. And when it came to Japan, all the lives they lost on Okinawa, all the lives they lost at Iwo Jima, none of this was going to compare to invading the home island. To this day, Japan occupies 7,000 islands. There are 7,000 islands to this day which run on Tokyo time. And in those days, it was much, much more. Can you imagine the Americans going through 7,000 Iwo Jimas, 7,000 Okinawas? There's no way they could keep up that momentum. They knew they had lost the war. There were many other factors coming in. The Gulf Stream, bringing in balloon bombs that would ultimately be used to deliver biocidals, etc. The Americans knew they had lost. So what were they going to do? They were going to destroy the world. So when they blew that bomb at Trinity Site, men like Leslie Groves, the men who had built the Pentagon, were banking on sacrificing all your children, your children's children, for all generations of all mankind and all humanity in the future, because if they could destroy everything God created in their vision, in their eyes, they would become as unto God. Ye shall be as God. That was their Satanism. They went for Satan. And they took that which was whispered into the eyes of the divinity and the ears of the divinity, that which was offered him by his vision of a material kingdom, and all of the whispers into what he could inherit if he would go into the direction of Luciferianism. The correct pronunciation, by the way, is Luciferism. That was an actual ideology that was developed, promoted, proselytized by Colonel Michael Aquino, who's entered his second game, by the way. He now is a columnist on Above Top Secret, and of course he...
Oh, Douglas? Douglas, you just got, somebody just did something to the your information. Can you repeat that? You said that Michael Aquino is a columnist on Above Top Secret?
That's correct. That's correct. He uses that as a forum now to recruit and to proselytize and recruit converts, while he spends his time, of course, denying that he worked with me, etc. So it's a situation where he's in his second game now. But he is the inheritor of a legacy of Satanists who were willing to destroy the very kingdom they had been tempted to inherit as the greatest mass sacrifice of all time. Because what could be more powerful? If you kill everybody, you have usurped creation itself. You have defeated the Creator. You've destroyed creation. They were banking on becoming as unto God. They could not create, but they could destroy all that was created. That was their philosophy. So what is that a product of? Product of deism, which is the philosophy of the Freemasons. The Founding Fathers were not godly men. They were not Christian men. They were deists. And the Founding Fathers of this republic were slave owners, and they were men who had believed in the Newtonian revolutionary concept of the clockwork universe. They helped to pioneer aspects of that philosophy. And of course, they believed in the concept of a God gone away, a creator who had created our mechanistic clockwork universe, set it in motion, and vacated the premises. And it was their job to fill in that void as gods unto themselves, that they should become as gods. That was the vision of the Founding Fathers. That is what led to the degeneracy into Satanism of the Pentagonalists, and that is who runs your nation today. Your Freemasonic occupation government has given way to the military junta, which has given way to debase Satanism and that which is beneath it. So these were men who were willing to destroy the world when they thought they would lose the war, and it fizzled. And they bring that up as this great triumph. What that Trinity test was an example of their desperation. If they had been winning on all fronts with massive production, like they always claim, why spend any money testing on a weapon which is highly experimental and which could potentially destroy the world? No one could deny that the physicists have all agreed on this. So the only reason they did it was because they knew they were losing and they were going to take everyone down with them. And when that failed, they had to sue for peace, and they've been maintaining themselves on the defensive ever since.
How did that fail, Douglas?
It failed because the world didn't end.
They actually did it. They actually did do what they wanted to do, but it didn't work.
That's quite right. The plutonium bomb. The plutonium bomb, by the way, was known as either Christie, they called it the Christie bomb, or they called it Gadget. So it was referred to as both, and that was the plutonium bomb that was developed domestically within the United States as opposed to the uranium bombs, which were developed by the Axis. The bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima was a piece of German ordnance. It was a uranium bomb. It was Axis standardized and developed. The bomb which was dropped on Nagasaki, which was much more powerful, was a plutonium bomb. That was the one that was tested at Trinity site. They never tested the uranium bomb because they already knew it worked because they had seen the Axis deploy it, the great operational effect. But they weren't deploying any of this to any strategic effect. They deployed both nuclear weapons strictly as weapons of terror. And they were both monumental failures, particularly the plutonium bomb. The original intent, once they found out it wouldn't destroy the world, was to deploy it to destroy the Kokura National Armory in Japan. When Boxcar, under Captain Sweeney, was flying over Kokura, they received shots fired. That's what penetrated their fuel tank and flooded the bomb bay, which contained the plutonium bomb, the most powerful bomb in the human inventory, with highly inflammatory, high-grade aviation, high-octane fuel. And at that, they panicked, and they turned around and flew back and dropped the bomb over Hiroshima in panicked retreat, Nagasaki. Now, Nagasaki's very geography, which is highly mountainous and has the city in a valley, deflected 90% of the energy that was released by the explosion of the plutonium bomb. So the majority of manufacturing facilities underground, all of them as a matter of fact, and all of their munitions workers survived. And they never knew a bomb had been dropped. So that was the ultimate failure of the plutonium bomb. It's why you never hear about it. All you hear about is Hiroshima, and Nagasaki gets second billing, even though that was the domestically manufactured, far more powerful bomb, was because it was such a failure and conducted as a drop in retreat and in a panic. So there you go. I mean, this is the corruption of the forces that you're up against, the powers and principalities. So recognize that you have far more strength than they do, morally, personally, and in terms of a society, and overcome it by overcoming their national security state mentality. How do we do that under the siege of a homeland security state? Well, first of all, by becoming conscious, by becoming aware, and one of the first things you can do is acknowledge what I'm saying and stop denying it or dismissing it. Everybody spends so much time denying or dismissing what I say. You'd be amazed at what they grab at. They grab at the tone of my voice. They grab at the manner in which I speak because English is a second language for me. They grab at anything, and in the end you realize they're really grabbing at straws. I let people call me on my own radio program, which is the Saturday Night Firing Lines on Saturday nights. I'm on for 2 hours, and I take anyone who calls. And I also do my own monologue on Tuesdays. So on Tuesdays, I monologue. On Saturdays, I dialogue. And this is from 7 to 10 Pacific time, and it's from 10 to midnight Eastern time. And this is on freedomslips.com. So all anyone needs to do is look up From Freedom's Lips to Your Ears, freedomslips.com, and look at the schedule. You'll know when I'm on. And you're always welcome to call. The only thing we cannot have you do, we're on Blog Talk, so I speak a lot more freely. We cannot have you drop the F-bomb. We don't want anyone using gender orientation slurs, ethnic slurs, or threaten lawsuits. Obviously, we cannot to take on any calls from anyone who behaves in that manner. But other than that, I accept anyone, and no one calls me who's a general. No one calls me who's a politician. No one calls me who's a history professor. No one calls me who's a scientist. I've been on for years and years now. And look me up online, and you'll find very few people who argue against me, and they are so few and far between, and I've answered what they said on air. So it's not like I don't respond when it's brought to my attention. But the point is, all of these people have the opportunity to call me. Why don't they just do it? I mean, if you look at all the people who are protesting what I say on YouTube, for instance, why don't they just call in? And nobody calls. Most everyone who calls is calling basically because they want to talk, they want my opinion on issues, but nobody really is calling up to challenge or contest what I'm saying. And the reason is because none of these people can. If someone is a history professor, if somebody is a general, they must feel at least obligated to challenge me if what I am saying is misleading or misinforming the public. They would have a moral obligation to call me and challenge me. But none of them do. You can't dismiss it by saying, oh, it's beneath their contempt. How long can that last? If I were truly causing a problem by saying something that were a lie, that were leading the public astray, at some point there would have to be an official response. So you see what I'm saying. And this is ultimately one of the things that verifies me more than anyone. I've been doing this for how long now? Since my mother's death in 2011. So we're talking about, 2014 now? It's been a good 2 or 3 years I've been on air. And at this point, if somebody hasn't shot me down by now, I think you better start taking what I'm saying pretty serious.
And, you brought up, one time I had the opportunity to talk to you. I think you said something along the lines of, the dark has been here a lot longer than the light. If that's what you said, could you reflect on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting point because that is the argument of the Temple of Set. Now, remember, when I articulate arguments, that's not necessarily advocacy. You need to understand how your enemy thinks if you're ever to be able to resist them or contend with them or prevent your loved ones from being of the Setenian philosophy, Set, of course, being the ancient divinity of Egypt of darkness, who later on was transmogrified by Christian religion into Satan. This entity, of course, is an entity of the night, of plagues, of darkness, of ill fortune. This is the entity that is worshipped by Colonel Michael Aquino and through his chaplaincy, the majority of your commissioned officers in the United States military. Now, in terms of their argument, their principle on which they act is that the dark was here long before the light, and that the light claved into the darkness through the Big Bang, and that it is an unnatural development, and that we must seek to return to oneness with the darkness. And the darkness is undeniably the majority of our universe. All of our hydrogen and helium, everything that goes into producing the stars and ultimately constitutes yourself, everything you know and love, rainbows, puppies, your children, your friends, everything that you care about in terms of the accomplishments of humanity, all of this constitutes materially, physically, less than 1/4%, less than a fraction or a tiny speck of 1% of the known universe. And so much of the rest of the universe is dark matter, dark energy. The darkness is all around us. It is predominant. So there's no denying that that's the case now. But when they launched the Max Planck satellite, named after the great Nationalsozialistisch, or what the Americans would pejoratively refer to as Nazis, the great Nationalsozialistisch scientist, Max Planck, who won the Nobel Prize for his development of quantum theory, they sent up a satellite named after him, the European Space Agency, of course. The Americans would never do so. They sent up a satellite to look at the beginnings of the universe to try and identify the origins of dark matter. Now, this was launched in May of 2009, and they have just now completed their mapping of our universe. It's done several cycles of image taking and relay of the universe going back in the past, because everything that we see when we look through space, we look through time, because everything we see is how it was light years ago. Our nearest neighbor, Alpha Centauri, we only see it as it existed 4 years ago because it's 4 light years away, and it takes 4 years for its light to reach us. So everything we see is in the past. And when they've looked into the deep past of our entire universe, they found out that originally all was light, that all of our universe was quite hot, quite very much a soup, burning various gases that were bright, very phosphorescent, if you will, and that was what formed the nebulas and ultimately the galaxies that would contain billions of stars. So the darkness and the dark energy, they don't know where that came from. But it wasn't here first. It invaded our universe later. So that introduces us to a whole new paradigm of what we're contending with. And therefore, the enemy, the people who represent darkness, are lying to you that the darkness was not here first, that it is invasive, that this is not your legacy or your future. So you asked about the cult of Saturn. At this point, I must confess to the fact that I'm so fried in my brain that I really can't consciously connect that to anything right now. I know it exists. The term Saturnalia, of course, refers to a very dark form of orgiastic bacchanalian self-indulgence or ecstatic orgy, etc. So Saturnalia, of course, has its a heavy occult meaning. Some people have etymologically affiliated it with Satan, but many stars are affiliated with such because, of course, his name, Lucifer, the Lightbringer, has affiliated him with a number of light-bearing bodies in our mythology. So there's no doubt that we could go into that in depth when I'm able to speak again. But
sure.
With your permission, kind sir, I would love for you to arrange through my mistress and manager, Lorian Ann Fenton, further interviews in the future, and hopefully we can continue our relationship in such a way that we both do some constructive awareness enhancement and raising of such consciousness on behalf of our listenership, as you've been doing through many of the other people you've been interviewing for quite some time. And I want to thank your producer, Jason, as well, for making it possible for you to do this. I want to emphasize to everyone that Disclosure Media Network started off with a third wheel who was basically a third wheel, and now it's operating much better as a motorcycle.
It is. Yeah, Jason's doing a fantastic job. He's doing a great job bringing the guests in and working on the website and putting in different media outlets as well. So, I appreciate that, Jason. Thank you. And Douglas, man, this is, once again, you have absolutely blown my mind wide open again. Every time I talk to you, do, and just the amount of listeners we've had on here and what they've had to say, completely enthralled, man. Dubious and just interested the entire time. I look forward to speaking with you again. Ladies and gentlemen, please check out Douglas's work, douglasdietrich.com. Check out the channyproject.com. That's an excellent forum for news. And also check us out at disclosuremedia.net. We're on YouTube, we're on Twitter, we're on Facebook, we're on TuneIn, as well as several other outlets. And Douglas, any other information you'd like to give us as far as to get your DVDs and information before we close, that'd be great, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Bless you. I really want to thank you for that opportunity. And I'll hold the line for a few minutes after we're off there as well, just so we could clarify any plans for the future. But definitely for the listenership, please, as Wookiee.Jedi says, and he's not a member of the so-called Jedi Knights that were involved with the School of Advanced Military Studies that produced our cadre of corrupt officers that radicalized bin Laden by their presence desecrating the holy lands of Al-Naqqa and Medina. Rather, he's a Jedi in the positive sense. Let's just say he's on the side of the light. But in terms
yes.
of what I'm contending with, keep in mind that you consider me as someone who is certainly educated in the Sith tradition, but of a rogue sort, so that you can interpret me as being on your side as much as I am able, but definitely familiar with the darkness, because it is all around us. Sometimes the darkness is all you have to work with, and you really have to learn the balance of our universe in order to appreciate that which you have and what's gifted to you by fate. So beyond that, one of the things that you can gift your friends and loved ones with is to check out my DVD set. One of them is Roswell and the Rising Sun. The production of that, it was very impacting on my life. That is essentially what led to the death of my mother. I came home to find her dying. I had to take her to the emergency room that very night, coming home from making that DVD. You can see how quickly and amateurishly it was put together, but nevertheless, you'll get the information from it that you need, and you'll see the images that you need to see on it. And that is coupled with another DVD, Satan's Crusaders. They're both together in a DVD set that's available to you for literally $20, $10 each DVD plus $4 or $5 for shipping and handling. So just check out what the price is, either $24 or $25 on DouglasDietrich.com. Once again, that's www. Douglas spelled with one S. Dietrich is spelled like the words diet and rich put together. Just put diet, D-I-E-T, together with R-I-C-H. And it's all lowercase, all one word, DouglasDietrich.com. And in terms of, if you want to remember the name with a great mnemonic, I am a distant relation to Marlene Dietrich, famous actress. The older among you will remember her. It's spelled exactly the same way as her family surname. So, aside from that, also check out MindControlSummit.com, www.mindcontrolsummit.com, all lowercase, all one word. For using the code word John 23, capital J, it's letter case sensitive. So capital J, then lowercase O-H-N, along with the numeric number 23, named after the year in which my mother was born. You can get yourself a deal for about $20, I believe the price is, to download 14 hours of audio video of my presentation at the last Super Soldier Summit in Las Vegas, prior to this one, which had all of the problems of, in the wake of it, the shootout with the police and the auto destruction of Jared and Mandy Miller, who were convinced that they were brainwashed and mentally controlled and seeking help to escape from what they'd been ordered to do, which was to massacre the Mind Control Summit and kill the would-be governor of Nevada, Mr. Vanderbeek, and the man who's running for the sheriff's office. So that is kind of the situation in the milieu in which we're dealing with. You can help us immensely by downloading that 14 hours of audio and video and buying the DVDs, and you would inform yourself greatly as well. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to cover that. I will be on Tiona Thaur, which is an Irish radio program. I'll be Skyping all the way to Ireland. That will start at about 1 p.m. in the afternoon Pacific time on Thursday, and what it's about 4 p.m. in the afternoon Atlantic Seaboard time, or Eastern Daylight time, this Thursday. So check that out by following my Facebook timeline and visit my public timeline at facebook.com/Douglas Duane Dietrich. My middle name Duane is spelled D-U-A-N-E, not with a W, but D-U-A-N-E. So Douglas Duane Dietrich on Facebook, facebook.com/Douglas Duane Dietrich, the public timeline, and you can e-friend me on my personal private timeline at Douglas D. Dietrich. So check those out. The private timeline, the bulletin board. The public timeline is much more of a personal presentation of my columns, and you'll be able to see my schedule for Tiona Thaur, which is Land of the Free in Gaelic, and other types of things that are happening in the near future. And of course, join me tomorrow night, Critical Omissions, Tuesday night, at 10 to midnight Eastern, and 7 to 9 p.m. Pacific. And I'll be on tomorrow night for 2 hours monologuing about different things like the Gaza crisis in the Middle East, and we'll happily go into some of the elements of that or whatever else is threatening current events when next I speak with Nordic Wookiee and Jason, and this is not Jason Voorhees with the machete that comes out of the woods with a hockey mask, but it's another Jason. They might be related.
He actually has one of those face masks.
Does he really? That's funny.
Oh, man. Well, Douglas, this has been great, and once again, after this interview, it just makes me think this. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you.